Ladies and gentlemen, today is April 13th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Doing well. It's super windy today, and I've played a ton of Dota recently, and my solo honor mode run is up to Raphael, but I have not fought him yet.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and the next patch hits in 2 days.
Ah, yeah.
So,
Some exciting new stuff to do soon.
yeah, we'll be able to make all the new subclasses. And that'll make it more fun to play with other people and also just do a solo run and you can try out 4 classes at once. I'm looking forward to doing that.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with all the new subclasses.
Well, I don't want to
Picked one of
sidetrack
them.
us too much because we could talk about that for a very long amount of time, but I'm super stoked. There are a whole bunch that I like that they added. And they're all already in D&D as a whole. So the D&D veterans have commented on the ones they added and stuff, and people are talking about their relative power levels and so on. But just the increase in options in what you can be and how you could resolve situations. So Glamour Bard stands out to me, where you can just manipulate situations by charisma. Like, people just do what you say, and because it feels good to do what you say, and you can just peaceably deal with people. Or heckin' Giant Barbarian. You get to be huge and smash stuff. That's awesome. Arcane Archer sounds really cool. Like, there are multiple cool archery things, and I like archery a lot. So yeah, I'm stoked.
That should be fun. Well, anything else you've been doing the past 2 weeks?
Um, did some farming work. We're out in the middle of nowhere here, and there's chickens, so we have to take care of the chickens, and we recently cleaned out their whole hen house sleeping area. Like, they have a enclosure that has, it's basically concrete enclosed, and it's heated in the winter to make sure that they're cozy and they have perches to sit on and stuff. But they so this is kind of gross, but they use the restroom in there as well. And over time, there's more and more buildup of it to where there's relatively less bedding and more of their excrement. So we clean that out. We put on safety goggles and safety masks and everything, and they have fresh bedding. But farm work is gross, and it needs to be done ultimately. So thank you, farmers, for doing farming and stuff so that we can comfortably eat food, even though farming is very hard work. Planning stuff is super hard work. The seasons, managing that, of like when shit will just up and die because it gets too cold for too long. Like, you have to live in the right place. You have to make the soil is good. There are so many different steps to it. Irrigation is a whole thing. Jeez Louise. Thank you, farmers. And I know you're not paid a ton, but the world needs to eat and everyone enjoys food. So good job.
Well, most of the food you eat is actually produced by large corporate farms these days.
Yeah.
But there's still a fair amount that comes from the small landholder as well. And it is very difficult work. There's always stuff to do.
That would be a question for global farming production. How much of it is corporate and industrial, and how much of it is local farmer?
Just in terms of like raw output,
Yeah.
most of it is corporate now.
Like 80%?
I want to say like 2/3, give or take. I'm not sure what the exact number would be, but it's fairly high.
Like 69%.
Sure.
Okay. Well, yeah, there's a hecking huge word that people are taking bets about how many times it's going to be said in this episode. Tariffs. Tariffs. There's even video compilations snipping Trump saying tariffs many times about how much he likes them and all the different amounts for them and how much money it's going to bring and all this kind of stuff. It's what's going on?
What's going on? Yeah, it's been quite the shit show. I think the last time we talked, I mentioned that the admin was going to implement its reciprocal tariffs, as they called them, on April the 2nd, and that it would be something that people heard quite a bit about when it did happen. And lo and behold, it came to pass. They did, in fact, implement them. And there's a lot of them. And that's pretty much been the drama around the world for the past 2 weeks. So,
Is it the tariffs that people sent back at us for the tariffs we put on them? And it's all the
No.
list of all those?
No.
Oh.
That's what they said it would be.
Uh-huh.
That's what the administration said would happen. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they were lying. To be blunt, that was a lie. They are not, in fact, reciprocal at all in that sense. I just call them reciprocal tariffs in order to distinguish them from all of the other tariffs that we've been talking about. So that'll be an ongoing label I use here, just to keep things simple. I'll send you a map.
Okay.
Oh, I'll have to attach it first. Yeah, we're going to talk quite a bit about that. Okay. That'll probably be most of tonight, honestly.
Okay.
Because there's a good deal to go over.
Well, is there anything... How do you want to structure it? Do you want to hit that first, or...
There's other stuff, but it's not really as big ticket.
Uh-huh.
You know, there's been some minor developments in Ukraine's peace... Well, the Trump administration's peace talks with Russia. But it hasn't been much substantive. It's not really going anywhere. Mm-hmm. There's been more people dying in Israel and Palestine, but that's kind of par for the course. So no shock there. It's been escalating recently, but no more so than one might expect, given the trajectory of the conflict over the past, year and a half now?
I thought you were going to say 2,000 years.
Well, yeah, there's that. Yeah, in the grand scheme of things, none of it's surprising at all, but certainly within the context of the current conflict in Gaza, as started by Hamas in October 23, it's pretty much still on rails. Not a lot has changed. Mm-hmm. Okay, there it is. So we'll take a look at that when you have time.
Sure.
But yeah, the tariff plan, easily the top item, and it's the one I've been preparing for.
Okay, thank you for your preparation.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I spent a lot of money to learn how to analyze this stuff, and now it's everybody's problem.
So, you might disclaimer out in front.
Oh yeah, the usual disclaimer.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And we do enjoy the feedback. Although this actually is kind of more my wheelhouse.
All right.
I have multiple degrees in economics, so
he's like,
if
yeah,
there's anything I can
economics
talk
stuff.
about with confidence, it's going to be this one.
Well, cool. Fire away, Captain.
All right. So the government said, that is to say, this is the Trump administration, like you mentioned, said that they wanted to have reciprocal tariffs. They said that other countries were tariffing the United States, and that U.S. tariffs for those corresponding goods were lower, and that this was unfair, and that they were going to fix it by setting American tariffs to equate with foreign tariffs. And then that was supposed to be the baseline for some kind of negotiation, as the Trump administration likes to call them. Other people like to call it extortion, but we'll get to that. Regardless, that's not what they did. They did not set tariffs to be equal to foreign tariffs. Instead, they basically did two main things. One, they set a baseline 10% tariff on just fucking everybody. Just, he tariffed the entire planet, Neuro. Every single country. There's a fucking uninhabited island that the US has 10% tariffs on now. So everybody got 10% tariffs. And then, in addition to that, he also had a chart. Anybody who's been paying attention to this saw the chart over the past 2 weeks, and it was a list of countries around the world. And what the administration said was their average effective tariffs on U.S. goods. And so they had a list of all of those, average aggregate effective tariffs, and then they had the corresponding tariff that they were going to apply in retribution to that. And they said that it would be reciprocal. Instead, they set it to be half. So they calculated all of these average effective tariffs, and then they set the retaliatory U.S. tariff to be half. Now, that was not additive with the 10%. The 10% rather was the minimum. So if anybody had average effective tariffs that were, let's say, 10%, then they would not have that and set the U.S. tariff at 5%. Instead, they would just set it at the 10% minimum.
So just to kind of break down what fundamentally is being projected here in terms of a move, this is saying you pay me more money for my stuff. Is that basically what you're doing? 10% of all the stuff that is going toward you, like you...
Anytime a good comes across the U.S. border, in other words, is imported, then whoever is importing it has to pay 10% of the value as a tax to the United States government. Okay. That is what a 10% tariff is.
So it just made it 10% more expensive for the whole world to send stuff to us that we buy.
It made it 10% more expensive for Americans to buy stuff from around the world.
Ew!
Because it is the people purchasing the good that are paying the tax.
Hey, that's bad for us. That's us.
Well, it depends on where you stand politically. Again, this is about protectionism, and allegedly it's about reshoring manufacturing to the United States. Rest assured, we'll be getting to that. I have like 100, 200 lines of stuff to get through here.
Okay.
That's going to be part of it. Don't worry.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, there is political logic to it. But yeah, we'll save that for later. For now, just know 10% minimum tariffs, and then even more for countries that have aggregate average effective tariffs that are at least twice as much as 10%.
Okay.
Now we're going to go through all of the countries. It won't take as long as it sounds, because most countries just got the 10% minimum. But I am going to go through all the ones that had higher than that. And so we're going to kind of go through who the winners and losers are in terms of countries, who the winners and losers are in terms of industries, some of the primary effects of the tariffs, the secondary effects of the tariffs, and then we'll do some conclusions and takeaways at the end. And then also critique. The critique section, spoiler, is going to take a very long time.
Okay. Uh-oh.
We'll get to that. But for now, we're just doing details. So that's what we're dealing with. The 10% tariffs, well, the reciprocal tariffs in general are not additive with the steel and aluminum tariffs that were set earlier. So the steel and aluminum tariffs are a separate thing. So it doesn't matter if your country got, 50% tariffs or whatever because of the reciprocal tariffs. If you're exporting steel, the tariff that your buyer is going to face is still going to be that 25% steel aluminum tariff. That's my understanding anyway, that they're not additive like that. Now, at the same time that they announced the reciprocal tariffs, let me get to this too. I lost track. So this chart, it listed average effective tariffs for all of the countries, and then the corresponding U.S. tariff that the Trump administration was implementing for them. And it was half of the average effective tariff. Now, here's the thing. Some people broke down the numbers, and what they found is that the government, again, was lying. Because the numbers that were supposed to be the average effective tariffs were not, in fact, the average effective tariffs. Now, the government later elaborated and pointed out that these were supposed to not just be average effective tariffs. They were supposed to be a kind of index number that incorporated average effective tariffs, but also accounted for various forms of non-tariff barriers to trade. Now, make of that what you will, but what people found is that what the administration actually did to calculate these numbers is to take imports from these countries and divide them. No, sorry, it was the trade deficit with these countries and divide it by total imports. That's, fuck, am I getting this right? Trade deficit divided by total imports. I want to say that's what it was. Chat can fact check me. They also had, they actually did release the function that they used to calculate this. And there were a couple other numbers that were supposed to be a part of the equation, but they actually canceled out. It was supposed to be a number representing the pass-through. In other words, the proportion of the tariff that's supposed to be passed through to the consumer. And then there was a separate number that was supposed to be price elasticity, no, import elasticity of demand, basically. And they set these numbers at 1/4 and then 4, such that they equal 1, which means that they just cancel each other out. Now, I'm not super up on like the modern cutting edge trade research on, import elasticities of demand and whatnot, but I'm pretty skeptical that they're going to cancel out to 1 with the pass-through number. So I suspect they just tacked them on. That's the suspicion that I've been reading anyway online.
To make it look fancier.
Yeah. So basically what the administration is doing is not reciprocal tariffs. What they've done is that they've created new tariffs that are a function of the trade deficit that the United States has with other countries. So if you have a larger trade deficit with, that is to say, if the United States has a larger trade deficit with the other country, then there's a higher tariff. So this is in effect a tax on countries that export more to the United States than they import. That's what's happening. And that's why I mentioned extortion earlier, because if you do trade more with the United States than the United States trades with you, well, let me rephrase, if you export more than you import from the United States, nominally the United States has some leverage as a buyer. And so the United States is trying to use that in order to try to coerce trading partners into something. The government is negotiating for something which they have not deigned to inform the public about, or apparently even really their trading partners. The whole strategy here, and more specifically the objective of the strategy, is still very unclear. So it's kind of hard to judge what's happening and why, which is bad because you should be communicating that. That should be a part of the negotiation. So as is, the Trump administration is doing what it did in its first term, which is trying to be unpredictable and then trying to extract value after applying pressure, which is exactly what I said a few months ago that they were going to do. So I've been right on the money here thus far as forecasting their behavior. Until we kind of know what they're trying to get, it's going to be hard to say whether or not this is effective, almost certainly not, and just how successful they're going to be in getting it. It may be that they never tell anybody what their actual objective is and that they're just fishing for concessions. And then whatever kind of concessions they get, they can then just repackage as a victory. That would kind of be in keeping with their previous behavior in international negotiations. So I'm a little dubious here that some analysts who say that there is some particular end game they're angling for, and we just don't see it yet, I'm a little dubious about that logic. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think in general, the Trump admin wants some manufacturing reshoring, wants some rebalancing of alleged burdens that the United States bears as a country having the reserve currency of choice in the world economy, and for providing various other global public goods. But at the same time, there's major flaws in all of that reasoning. Just the idea that those are things that are worth addressing in the first place. Like I said, I'll get to those later. But that being the case, like it's just hard to judge. So another thing that they announced, was a 25% car tariff on everyone. This was another just tariff everybody. And this is something that they had sort of preliminarily implemented last month when they implemented 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And ultimately, automakers were able to successfully lobby a delay in implementation for those tariffs. And the idea was that foreign car makers that were not, exporting cars into the United States from Canada or Mexico had an advantage over other car makers, specifically American car makers that were exporting their cars and car parts from Canada and Mexico. So they said that was unfair, and so the admin agreed, and they decided to delay them. But now the delay is over. Now everybody faces those same tariffs. Now, for now, they don't apply to car parts. For now, it's just cars, and also knockdown kits for cars, which is basically the same thing. But they have said that they are going to encompass car parts starting next month. So that's coming, allegedly. You're going to see why that might be ephemeral. So the admin has said that these car tariffs are also not additive, like the steel and aluminum tariffs, with the reciprocal tariffs that they've implemented. These are a separate category of tariffs that are going to be basically standalone. And for those interested, the legal justification for this was Section 232 of the Economic Emergency Powers Act passed in the 1970s. That's an act that people are going to get very familiar with in the coming months. Let's see, what else? It does not apply to anything that is not a passenger vehicle or a light truck. So motorcycles, buses, other types of vehicles, those are not covered by the 25% tariffs. It's just cars and trucks, basically, specifically light trucks. Now, there is an exemption for those cars that are being imported that are eligible for lower tariffs under CUSMA, which is the NAFTA update agreement Trump negotiated in his first term. So long as they comply with the rules of origin in that agreement, they can still get the lower tariff. And the car parts are exempt until May 4th specifically. Now, I actually read the White House, I read the announcement of this tariff on the whitehouse.gov website. And I found there's just some interesting details that didn't quite get reported in the media. They kind of mentioned that there were some exemptions, but they didn't actually go into detail about the nature of those exemptions. So one of the things they talked about in the announcement is that they're actually going to try to tariff the non-US components in cars. So the idea here is that, cars and car parts cross the border multiple times because manufacturers have suppliers on both sides of the border, and so they all interact with each other. It's a very interdependent system. It's an ecosystem that's evolved over the past couple decades since NAFTA was first implemented. So what the government apparently wants to do is not give a full exemption for cars and car parts that are CUSMA compliant under rules of origin rules. What they want to do is they want to give partial exemption only for the value of the cars and car parts that encompasses goods, components, inputs in those goods that were made originally in the United States. The portion of the product's value that is comprised of inputs that are made in Canada or Mexico would actually be taxed under the new tariff. They would not be exempt. So it's kind of like a half exemption, half tariff. It's very strange. They haven't implemented it yet, again, with car parts, because that's been delayed. They apparently actually already are doing this with cars. So cars coming into the United States or from Mexico, for example, are not fully exempt under CUSMA. They're sort of, if it's like 70% parts that were made in the US, then they apply the lower tariff to that 70% value, however much the car is worth. And then the higher tariff is applied to the remaining value of the car. If this sounds complicated, then it is. And automakers are not enjoying it. There's a lot of automaker lobbyists in Washington that are trying to get the US government to redefine the definition of US-made parts to encompass parts made in Canada and Mexico. so that they can get the lower tariff that is supposed to be applied under the CUSMA agreement. Okay, so that's reciprocal tariffs, car tariffs. Another thing that the government did is that they finally did close the de minimis exemption for low-value imports, specifically for those from China. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, basically there was an agreement in place where if you shipped something to the United States from abroad and it was beneath a certain value, then you didn't have to pay any tariffs on it whatsoever. Not even lower tariffs under various free trade agreements that the United States has signed. They just wouldn't charge you because it wasn't really worth the effort of actually processing it through the normal customs process. The US gets so many packages that it's easier just to wave a lot of the cheaper ones on through. Now, there are certain companies in China that had been taking advantage of that, specifically Temu and Shine, however it's pronounced, that were basically doing customized manufacturing on an individual basis. So instead of like mass shipping goods across the ocean into the United States, they would take specific orders from people and then they would make them and ship them individually. And the individual packages would be eligible for the de minimis exemption, which gave them a small advantage over other manufacturers. So this exemption has now been closed. It was actually closed months ago initially, but there was a big outcry about it, especially from various manufacturers in the United States who were enjoying that relatively cheap avenue for certain kinds of goods that they could get without paying any kind of tariffs or going through customs delays and whatnot. So they delayed it, but now the delay is over and it is in place. So they basically just gave companies time to adjust to the end of the exemption. So Chinese companies are going to struggle on account of that. China has very high tariffs now. Again, we'll get to that. And the result then for US consumers is that anybody who has been buying a lot of stuff from Temu or Shein, that stuff is going to be a lot more expensive now. If current tariffs are any indication, it's going to be more than twice as expensive.
Oh.
About 2.5 times as expensive, actually. So I hope everybody enjoyed that while it lasted, those of you who bought from it, but that's probably going to end unless there's some kind of re-export shenanigans, which happens, which is entirely possible, but for now, it looks like that is closed. Okay, so update. So this is something from a couple days ago. So the 10% tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs were announced April 2nd, but they weren't supposed to be implemented until April 9th. And so April 9th, a couple days ago, came, the tariffs were implemented. Stock markets were not happy. I'm sure everybody remembers it. But there was also some other stuff that happened. We'll get to that. But one of the big items was that the government announced a 90-day pause on all tariffs over 10% that had been announced on April 2nd. So the 10% hike, that happened for everybody. That was still implemented. But the higher tariffs that had been announced for various countries, those have not been implemented yet. Those are on pause for a month and a half. However, the government also announced that this pause would not apply to higher tariffs on China. So those tariffs have been implemented, and China currently has, well, very high tariffs. We'll get to that too. There's been some drama there. Now, at the same time the tariffs were announced, there were also announced exemptions from the tariffs for various industries and goods. So we'll go through those. The tariffs will not apply to energy imports, specifically oil. They will not apply to semiconductors. They will not apply to goods imported from Canada or Mexico that are eligible under the rules of origin rules in the CUSMA agreement. Obviously, that's not entirely true, as we saw with the cars and car parts, but for other stuff, yeah, that's still true. You can still import your Mexican corn, for example, at the lower CUSMA negotiated rate. Reciprocal tariffs will not apply to Russia, Belarus, North Korea, and Cuba, because sanctions are already on those countries, and that apparently means they don't need to apply tariffs to them. If you think that's weird logic, I agree with you. I don't really see the sense in that, but that's what they decided to do. Let's see, we already talked about that. Copper. So the reciprocal tariffs will not apply to imports of copper. They will not apply to imports of lumber. They will not apply to imports of pharmaceuticals. And here's a funny one. They will not apply to imports of bullion, specifically gold. Fucking gold bugs. We'll get to that. Also, the tariffs will not apply to, quote unquote, certain minerals not available in the US. The government was a little cagey about that, but markets interpret that to refer to rare earths materials that the United States imports from abroad, mostly China.
Dude, what is it with rare earths lately?
I mean, we can get into that. The short Cliff Notes version is that rare earths are an important input for advanced technologies, especially electronics, chips, semiconductors, what have you. All of those use a fair amount of rare earths as critical materials necessary to actually make the product. They're also used in a lot of renewable energy and other new technologies like that. So they're seen now as a very strategic resource. Well, I should say they've always been a strategic resource. They've always been used in electronics. But they're more important now because after the Cold War, the United States and the West, basically the entire world, lost the ability to produce these materials because they regulated them until it was unprofitable to do, and it was just easier to let low-cost producers abroad that were willing to deal with all of the pollution that these industries generate. And alas, that country happened to be China for the most part. They now dominate rare earths. So there's kind of a big push. There's been a big push over the past 10 years to try to diversify supplies and sources of rare earth materials, as well as the refining of those materials, so that the West is less dependent on what is now perceived as a major strategic rival. So that's why rare earths get a lot of attention. So this was the original list of exemptions, and then yesterday, there were new exemptions announced. The new exemptions encompass smartphones, computers, various computer components, solar panels, and sundry other electronics.
What's with all these exceptions? Are these random, or is someone benefiting from this?
They're quite strategic, actually. They make sense. Well, they make sense in terms of trying to mitigate disruption to key industries, major economic actors. Copper, for example, is a major input for semiconductor production. And one of the things Washington has been trying to do over the past 10 years is try to reshore more production of microchips. We import most of them now. One of the big objectives under the Biden administration in passing the CHIPS Act was trying to create an industrial policy that would subsidize new production facilities for microchips in the United States. So if you do want people to manufacture microchips in the United States, it doesn't really make sense to put a very high tariff on one of their key inputs, that being copper. We do make some copper in the United States, but not nearly enough to meet all of the needs of semiconductor producers. So if we are serious about semiconductor production in the United States, we need to facilitate cheap importation of copper. So that's what they're doing there. They gave an exemption for that purpose. Energy is just about minimizing disruption to Americans. We import a lot, especially from Canada, also a fair amount from Mexico, as well as just in broad generally. So by exempting energy, you're mitigating the cost to, say, gasoline prices, which people would definitely notice. Semiconductor exemption speaks for itself. That's part of reshoring semiconductors. Pharmaceuticals, they said that they were giving an exemption to pharmaceuticals, but they also said that they were going to tariff it later. So I wasn't sure at the time if they were serious about that or if that was just basically them trying to cover their ass. It seems like they're going to do it. They've made more recent announcements that they're moving that direction, but I still don't know if they're going to be serious about it. Pharmaceuticals are a sensitive area for the United States because it has a very large elderly population that obviously uses lots of drugs. And so putting a big tariff on pharmaceuticals would impose a big cost on those people, as well as just sick people generally, as well as on the healthcare system generally, because insurance companies obviously pay for a lot of pharmaceutical goods. And of course, the United States government itself, through Medicare and Medicaid, also spends a lot of money on pharmaceutical goods. So a big tariff there is going to increase costs for all of those actors. And given the way international trade is right now, there's not a whole lot of alternatives to the current trade partners that the United States imports pharmaceuticals from, that being principally India and China. So it's not as though putting tariffs on that stuff is going to result in like immediate reshoring or the market shifting to alternatives. It's going to result in the short term big spikes in prices. And the short term here is probably years. It's not going to be something that's resolved like just within 2025. It'll take years to build up the manufacturing capacity to completely reorient the supply chain here in a way that Washington wants. And honestly, it's probably not even going to happen in a way that Washington wants. It's probably just going to redistribute production to other foreign countries that the US will then import from. So pharmaceuticals, not entirely clear why an exemption was given to them, but that's my best guess. Bullion, that's a finance thing. Financiers love gold, not just for themselves. Obviously, they invest in it to a degree themselves, but also they love to con people into buying it. You can watch any number of news programs, especially cable news programs, and you'll see lots of gold commercials. And that's basically the gold industry trying to find rubes. You can invest in gold smartly. It's not a bad investment. But the trouble is that a lot of people treat it like a speculative investment, and then they get rug pulled later on and lose a bunch of money. I've had relatives who have gone through that. So my personal impression of gold in the gold industry is pretty negative, you might guess. But I suspect that financiers probably talked the administration into giving that exemption because it is a big part of their business. Let's see, rare earths speaks for itself. It's a major input for the electronics industry, including semiconductors. And again, if we're serious about building semiconductors here, we don't want to tax their inputs. So that's another semiconductor giveaway. So the more recent exemptions are a little harder to interpret. You could say that this is the Trump administration. Again, I'm talking about the new exemptions given to smartphones, computers, computer components, solar panels, electronics. This is all stuff that the US imports mostly from China. So these exemptions are definitely a big gift to Chinese exporters. So there are different ways to interpret it. One is that it's the administration trying to signal de-escalation with China to try to get them to negotiate. Others interpret it as the administration blinking. There's been lots of drama in the US stock market and the bond market, as well as from major manufacturers in the United States and other major industries affected by these tariffs. And I would point out again that a lot of these industries that sell this stuff in the US, they don't have a lot of alternative suppliers available to Chinese producers. That's not something they could diversify away from in the short term. So this would, if actually implemented, that is to say, if the higher tariffs were actually implemented, they would be hurting for a prolonged period of time while new supply chains were built out. And it's not clear that they would even be able to survive that, or even if they did, they would have to probably borrow a lot of money to do it, or get a lot of money from the government. So regardless, some say that the Trump administration heard all of the screeching and then decided that this was too much and that they want to back off. Now, maybe they want to back off permanently and just focus on tariffing other stuff and using that as leverage in their negotiations. Or maybe this is a temporary reprieve that they'll return to later on, depending on how things go with China and other trade partners. Not clear at all. Nobody knows. The exemptions themselves were a big surprise. If you want good drama and good laughs, go visit the Wall Street Bets subreddit. People on there have been screaming bloody murder for weeks now about how unpredictable all of this bullshit is. Actual traders, institutional investors and whatnot, are not in a much better mood. They do not appreciate all of this uncertainty. They have no idea what the fuck is happening, and nobody knows how to plan around this or strategize around it. Because again, the policy seems to change almost daily, and radically in some cases.
I had a question. How long does it take for a tariff, if we say that it's a tariff and then the paperwork goes through, until that actually is applied to new transactions?
It can apply immediately. There's no need for a delay.
Oh.
They only implement any kind of delay as a kind of gift to industries so that they don't Basically, when you order something, it takes time for it to get to the United States. So if you order something before a tariff is even announced, then when that good gets to the United States, you'll have to pay for that tariff when it's implemented, even if it is implemented, even if it was announced before, after you made the initial order. And that screws with a lot of businesses, obviously. So generally, governments, when they want to impose new tariffs, they announce it, and then they have a time period, like a month or a couple months before it's actually implemented, so private sector actors can reorient their supply chains and orders as necessary. So how much time between announcement and implementation is purely at the discretion of a given government. Again, if they want to, they can just announce them and do them immediately. It's just they don't, because that's more disruptive.
Gotcha.
Yeah, all they have to do is basically just, whenever you import something, or almost with everything you import, you have to do paperwork. And so generally the value of what you're importing is a part of that paperwork. So if you want to implement a tariff, all you have to do is announce that all of the stuff that goes through customs has to be assessed a certain tax, however much. And if you don't pay the tax, then you don't get your stuff. That's basically the way it works. So if you're a manufacturer who is importing a bunch of stuff, then you are very much at the mercy of a government. They can easily just confiscate all of your stuff that you have in inventory that is going through customs anyway, and then just say, hey, you either pay us this new tariff that we just announced in the last hour, or you don't get any of it.
Seems hostile.
It is. It's hostile to trading partners. It's hostile to business, both foreign and domestic. And it's generally not something governments do unless they have very good reason, or at least a very good plan. That's one of the big reasons that markets have not really enjoyed the Trump roller coaster as far as this tariff policy. They don't really see the plan, and they don't really see the reason and rationale behind it. And that makes everybody deeply skeptical about the veracity of this policy. So speaking of plans, that's the next section. So what exactly is the plan here? So some things that the administration has said. One, nations have treated the U.S. badly, quote unquote. He again brings up disproportionate tariffs, which, as we've discussed, is not really true. He says that amounts to cheating, and he turned, okay, we already discussed like specifically what they were. He also says, quote, the tariffs will not be full reciprocal. I could have done that, yes, but it would have been tough for a lot of countries, end quote. So that refers to him setting the reciprocal tariffs at half of the allegedly effective average tariffs, as per the chart that the administration produced. He says other leaders around the world will start calling, asking for exemptions, and that his price is going to be opening up their markets. The administration also says that states should not retaliate, and that if they do, it will result in escalation.
Don't fight back or we will punish you. Okay.
Yeah, that went over about as well as you would expect. So all told, the administration's messaging has been very inconsistent as to the purpose of the tariffs. They've sent signals that it's meant to reshore manufacturing, that it's meant to raise revenue to pay for tax cuts, that it's meant to create leverage to negotiate some kind of new global trade regime. There is some evidence now that they're kind of going for negotiating a new global trade regime, what some people have called a potential Mar-a-Lago Accord. We'll get a little more into that. Well, I guess we'll get into it now. There was a YouTube video by a YouTuber called Money and Macro. I guess that's the channel, not the YouTuber. And it's one of the better, if not the best, economics YouTube channels. And he dug up a document by the current sitting Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Bissant, I guess. And it was basically a white paper in which he sort of outlined how the administration would operationalize its trade policy. And one of the things that he argued in the paper should be done is a new accord, which would involve all of America's various trading partners, in which the world would kind of collectively agree to help the United States devalue its currency. The idea there being to try to make US manufacturers more competitive in the global marketplace. Presumably, this would coincide then with a cooperative effort to raise interest rates abroad at the same time that the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates in the United States in order to help facilitate the currency devaluation. Now, I'm a little dubious about the veracity of this document. It is a genuine document, but I've kind of learned the hard way over time that various subordinates within the Trump administration hierarchy often produce argumentation that is meant to rationalize Trump's policy preferences, but that the actual argumentation and rationalization itself rarely itself ends up being accurate as far as the motives behind these policy preferences. I think some critics of Trump have called this sane washing, basically just kind of trying to provide cover from what is otherwise a capricious and seemingly random set of policy preferences that can change over time and that don't seem to have any clear end objective. I don't know that that's entirely fair. I think there is some rationale behind what the administration is doing, but I'm also pretty dubious that this isn't anything other than an attempt to get kind of cover for a general direction that Trump wants to go in, but that doesn't necessarily have a clear end destination in mind. Again, Trump's MO is to apply pressure and extract concessions as much as he can. That's not really a specific detailed plan. That's just a generic approach to trying to get wins as he defines them. So I don't think that there's clear-cut strategy here happening, and I think this document is just another example of one of the administration's people trying to rationalize it. But we'll see. We're all going to see. It doesn't really matter if I'm right or wrong. The administration is going to keep doing this regardless. They've made that pretty clear. So we're going to find out the hard way regardless. So long story short, the plan here is unclear. That's the takeaway there. So retaliation. Contrary to what the administration wanted, there has been moves towards retaliation. Although I would point out that in almost all of these cases, the announced retaliation was never implemented. They would announce retaliation and they would announce a future date by which it would be implemented, and generally negotiations with the Trump administration would see implementation either canceled or delayed further. With one notable exception. You can probably guess what it was. So first, Brazil. The Brazilian government, specifically its legislature, passed a bill authorizing the government to retaliate against trade duties, basically trade tariffs, from any country. Obviously, that refers to the United States. They have not actually used this power to implement retaliatory tariffs, but it is in their toolkit, and depending on how the negotiations track out, they may end up doing this. But for now, nothing has happened. Let's see, the UK is drawing up a potential bill that would allow them to retaliate, but for now they say they want to focus on negotiating with the US government. The European Union, for its part, has done a little more. They prepared a package of tariffs that are ready to go, and are basically a repeat of the same tariffs that they implemented in Trump's first term. The more things change, the more they stay the same. However, they have not implemented this yet, and they say they want to negotiate first. The package that they have on tap right now is basically tariffs on $28 billion worth of U.S. imports. And it's going to include, if implemented, U.S. meat, cereals, wine, wood, clothing, chewing gum, dental floss, vacuum cleaners, and toilet paper. It sounds like kind of a random grab bag of stuff, but the way retaliatory tariffs are designed, they focus on key political constituencies. So, for example, back in the first Trump administration, one of the things trading partners did when they retaliated against tariffs was to try to design their tariffs to punish specific states that had voted for Trump, or that were governed in the Senate or House of Representatives by leading conservative representatives of one kind or another. So, for example, Mitch McConnell was the head of the Senate at that time, and so a lot of tariffs particularly sought to hit whiskey, which is one of the big exports from Kentucky. Mitch McConnell being a representative from Kentucky. So that's the idea. You know, you don't just apply tariffs on all of the major exports of a trade partner that you're feuding with in terms of trade. You try to find key constituents that are disproportionately influential to the government's leadership, and then you try to tariff stuff that they are the most sensitive to. Sometimes that results in tariffs that in aggregate do not tariff value, aggregate value of imports that is as large as the tariffs of the trading partner that have been imposed on you. But if you do targeted tariffs, that doesn't necessarily matter. You could end up having disproportionate effect just because you're targeting people that have basically the leadership's ear. And they may even be economic interests that the leadership itself is invested in. Let's see, the president of France also suggested retaliation could come in the form of suspending European investments into the United States until, quote, things are clarified, end quote. As you might guess, Europe is a pretty fractious place, and so there's some divergence of opinion among different states about how to approach the problem. Ireland, for its part, stated that it wanted a reasoned response, whatever that means. The Italian government questioned whether retaliation was even really necessary. And then Hungary, unsurprisingly, said that the European Union should just lower its own tariffs and accept the new regime. Like I said, the EU suspended their tariffs, their retaliatory tariffs, pending negotiations. That was a response to the announcement that the US elevated tariffs beyond 10% would be paused for 90 days. I had some quick notes here on leverage as far as relations between the US and the European Union. The US financial sector actually has pretty decent leverage over Europe. A good chunk of European finances are, I should say, the market share of certain sectors in European finance are dominated by US producers. Most of the financial sector is actually dominated by European banks. So it's not like American financiers are dominant everywhere, but there are key sectors where they are dominant, and that's where US leverage is. Specifically, payment processing, I think, is the one that I had noted. Oh, also derivatives trading. US banks have 28% of the market for derivatives trading in Europe. Let's see, and yeah, payment processing is the big one, though. I think something like 2/3 of the market for payment processing in Europe is held by US banks of one kind or another. Let's see, also US banks have, I already mentioned derivatives. They also have 77% of all fees from commodities financing. Oh, sorry, that's foreign banks. A good chunk of that is going to be Switzerland. But there's also going to be a lot of US banks there. Let's see. And then also another point of liability for European banks. They were found not to have enough dollars to cover all of their dollar-denominated assets. So if there is some kind of pinch that happens, either artificially or naturally, through organic market behavior, that requires these banks to suddenly need to cover all of their dollar-denominated assets, they may not be able to do that. So what the European Union found is that 1/3 of European bank liabilities are in dollars, but only 1/5 of their reserves are in any kind of international currency, dollars or otherwise. So that means that European banks could be vulnerable to American disruption in the supply of dollars. Although I would point out that would come with a lot of penalties for the United States too, but that is a hypothetical point of leverage for the United States. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of the tech industry in Europe is basically American. American software, American social media companies, those are pretty dominant as far as market share in Europe. Now, for reasons we can get into later, and I think we will, if I have all of my notes organized properly, which I probably don't, being a consumer, a large buyer, actually does grant you a lot of power in your own right. And this is actually a reflection of the Trump administration's own logic vis-a-vis China. China exports a lot to the United States, and that actually gives the US a kind of degree of monopsony power over China, which is basically what Washington is currently trying to leverage. Now, in so much as the Europeans are vulnerable because they are dependent on imports, quote unquote, of American tech services of one kind or another, they actually have a very similar kind of monopsony power. And this is actually why European regulations of the tech sector are so impactful, even in the United States, where those laws don't technically apply. Because the European Union is such a big market, when the Europeans regulate tech companies in the United States, they generally apply the same standards even in the United States. And that actually represents a point of leverage for the European Union. Because one of the things that the Trump administration and actually several previous administrations have been feuding with the European Union about is European regulation of tech companies, which of course disproportionately affects US firms. So the European Union could kind of hold that sword over American tech companies and hold them hostage as part of this overarching trade negotiation. So in other words, Europe has some points of vulnerability beyond just trade in goods in terms of services, but they also have some advantages there. Let's see, Canada retaliated for the tariffs on cars. Specifically, they hiked tariffs on imports of cars from the United States. However, they offered an exemption to firms that keep production of cars and car parts in Canada. More specifically, the exemption will be based on the Canadian content of those cars sold in Canada. Taiwan said that it will not retaliate for the tariffs imposed on it and will seek negotiations. And they've said that they've offered 0% tariffs on all US imports as a baseline for those negotiations. Japan, for its part, has said that it's going to seek negotiations. I infer from that that they're not going to retaliate in the short term. So that brings us to China.
Japan, just before you go on, I told my friend about this, that Shinzo Abe and his wife both figured out how to schmooze with Trump in a way that gets on his good side, just by throwing a bunch of flattery at the start, and then he gets in a super good mood, and then you can do whatever you want from there. But it's a very specific formula that requires you to almost lower yourself to make them feel accommodated and feel uplifted by your flattery.
Mm-hmm.
And many world leaders do not want to have to do this.
Yeah, it comes with a certain political cost, because your political enemies can point at you and say that you're weak.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if that kind of flattering requires you to actually give substantive concessions that are harmful to key political interest groups in your country, you're going to be very resistant to that. Mm-hmm. There is some friction there. So that's why it's actually easier for dictators to do it, because they don't have to give a shit.
Mm-hmm.
If they crush and ruin a few lives back in their home countries, that's just par for the course. They don't mind doing that. But it's harder to do if you're a democratically elected leader. Now, the leaders of Japan are democratically elected, but it comes with an asterisk. A single party has governed Japan almost continuously for the past 70-some years, with, I think, only 2 or 3 interruptions in that entire time span. Japanese politics largely happens within that party rather than between parties. So there is kind of a little more of a barrier in terms of accountability between Japan's leadership and their people, a bigger barrier than would exist in other democracies. So Shinzo Abe and the current leader, Yoshida, they have a little more room to maneuver as far as being obsequious than, say, the Prime Minister of Canada or the European Union's leadership.
Gotcha.
A little bit different there. So hence the discrepancy.
Sorry to derail you. You were going to talk about China next.
Yeah. Are you ready for more dumb shit?
I'm ready for the dumb shit. Lay it on. What's going on, brother?
Okay. So, and I'm still getting to the part where I actually detail what the specific tariffs on all of these countries were. But spoiler, the reciprocal tariffs implemented on China were about 35%. So China retaliated by imposing a 35% tariff on all American imports. Ooh. The Trump administration retaliated a few days later with additional tariffs on China of 84%. Which raised aggregate tariffs on China to 104%.
Wow.
So that's 84 on top of the initial 35 announced as part of the reciprocal tariffs.
This is like a poker hand where it's like, I bet. And it's like, oh yeah, I call. Oh, you call? I raise. And it's like, oh my gosh.
Well, there's more of that coming because China then retaliated to that a few days later with a new tariff that raised aggregate tariffs on US goods to 84%. So the Trump administration retaliated to that retaliation by raising aggregate tariffs on Chinese goods to 145%, which also included as part of it a 20% tariff in retaliation for fentanyl trade that they apparently had forgotten to announce. That's a whole other thing. But basically, they raised it, total tariffs on China to 145%. So China retaliated to that retaliation for the earlier retaliation by raising aggregate tariffs on US imports to 125%. And that time, they also announced that they would not retaliate to further increases in US tariffs because the current levels of tariffs between the two countries were trade prohibitive. Basically, nobody can trade under these conditions anyway, so further increases are pointless.
Let's just agree not to trade. We just keep escalating. Let's just stop our trade. That's crazy. That's just ego. It's ego of both countries, neither one admitting to back down to the other. Because it's just, it's a hostile move, so you want to play back at it. I mean, I get it. It's just, wow. Seems very silly. So our shit is going to get more expensive. That's kind of the theme that I'm mentally and emotionally preparing for. Is the prices that you thought that stuff was, that's not what it is anymore. It's like, it's more than that.
It's going to go up. I would add the caveat, however, that the private sector was expecting something like this to happen. I don't know that they expected it to be this dumb, but they did expect there to be trade drama of some kind. And so in anticipation, for the past 6-some months, they've been shoring up their inventories. They've been buying lots of stuff, especially stuff they buy from China, and creating a big pool of stuff that they can use to try to ride this out for a couple of months. Not more than that. They don't have enough inventory to kind of withstand this siege for years on end, but they have enough to last for a couple months.
What
After
stuff?
that,
like just random tables and shit that you order?
for example, the United States imports a lot of furniture from China.
Yeah, so tables.
Yeah, tables are a good example.
They have like storehouses full of tables and random crap that we order online, just in case.
Yeah, just anything you import, cars, car parts, shoes, textile goods of various kinds, anything that American sellers import from abroad, they have been trying to hoard over the past 6 months to try to create a kind of reserve that they can use. Because so long as they have built up inventories, they don't have to change their prices in the short term. So let's say that this whole trade kerfuffle just goes away, which I point out is entirely possible at this point. Nothing would surprise me at this point. Lots of things would shock me, but little would surprise me. So if this all goes away today, none of this will necessarily matter, because all of these producers selling stuff in the US, they'll have that inventory that they can tap. Now, what's going to happen probably is that this is going to last for a couple months while all of these supposed new trade deals are being negotiated. I don't know how the admin is going to negotiate 70 fucking trade deals with 70 different countries.
Seems like a lot of work.
Months. Yeah, it's not realistic. So either it's not going to happen or they're going to do bullshit half work and then claim that they did it. Given the administration's record, it's almost certainly going to be the latter, but we'll see. We'll see. But because this is going to last for a few months, that means a few months of uncertainty in terms of international trade. And so what's going to happen is that all of these companies that have built up inventories, they're going to keep prices the same even despite the tariffs, including the very high tariffs on China. And they're going to eventually run out of inventory in a few months, probably around the summer. And then you're going to see the price hikes. And this is pretty much what I said would happen. I would point out a few months ago. New tariffs would not result in an immediate rise in prices. Rather, there would be a delay while inventories ran out as companies tried to wait things out. And it would only be at the end of that period when inventories expired that they would eventually finally raise prices to reflect the cost of higher tariffs.
Once the cheap table storehouses are empty, that's when we'll turn the trade back.
Yeah, and again, that's going to happen around summer, probably around June, July, maybe. So in the meantime, you might not see that much inflation, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of Trump supporters who try to point to that and say, see, it's not that bad. Well, that being short-term price changes are not going to be indicative of the full weight that tariffs are going to impose on the US economy. You're going to have to wait to see that till later. And I suspect what will happen is that all of these producers that import lots of stuff are going to wait things out, and then if their inventories do run out over the summer, and they are set to raise prices, they'll probably go running to the government and say, hey, this is really going to fuck us. We didn't think you would actually do this. Please reverse this change or give us some kind of relief. So we could see big subsidies to major sellers in the United States, probably as a function of their political connections to the government, or the administration could do a big reversal and ease a lot of the tariff pressure. Or maybe neither, and they actually do just stick with high tariffs and everybody gets fucked by inflation. That's also possible. There's different ways this could go, and again, one of the big problems markets face right now is that nobody has any fucking idea which of them is going to happen. So, tariff tit for tat with China. You can argue that this is basically Trump just fulfilling his promise, that if they hadn't retaliated, then there would have just been negotiations. But keep in mind that China has been preparing for this for like 10 years now. Ever since the first Trump administration started trade feuding with China, the Chinese government has been assuming that there would be a greater breakout of trade conflict. And they have been trying to fortify their economy. So this is a siege that they have been preparing to withstand and probably will withstand. And the trade retaliation that they have implemented, while it has resulted in escalation, like the Trump administration said it would, that's escalation that they were also prepared for. Beijing probably doesn't see any point in negotiating with what they see as a hostile partner that is pretty much hell-bent on significantly curbing imports from China. Now, you could argue that actually the Trump administration is not interested in significantly cutting imports. They just want some kind of deal in which there's a recalibration to some degree. Now, that could be true, but my impression is that Beijing doesn't think that's true. My impression is that they see this as a hostile regime and that they're going to treat it like a hostile regime. And there's actually growing calls from the Trump administration for them to reach out to them. They hit them very hard with the tariffs, but as the Chinese government has proven recalcitrant and resistant to calls to negotiate, the administration now is actively requesting that they call them, which is not something they'd done initially. At first, they imposed the tariffs apparently with the implicit assumption that the Chinese would come to them, and that hasn't happened. So now they're kind of sending signals that they're open for negotiation, but the negotiation isn't happening yet. Apparently, the Chinese did approach them early on for a negotiation, but they were rebuffed. One theory I've read is that the Trump administration was upset at some of the language one of the Chinese negotiators used. There was apparently a call with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, in which the Chinese negotiator asked that the Trump administration behave itself, basically. Conduct yourself well, I think was the specific phrase used. And that didn't go over well, as you might expect with egotists, and so that resulted in an early shutdown of the trade negotiations. Now, for the Trump admin, that was probably their way of trying to signal strength. But from the Chinese perspective, that probably was just confirmation that the government in the United States was hostile and that future negotiations would be pretty pointless. Hence the siege warfare that they've been taking. Let's see. So, in addition to the tariffs, the Chinese have also retaliated in other ways, specifically with export controls. So I have a list of them here. The Chinese government created a list of entities called the Unreliable Entity List, which is basically a list of companies that Chinese companies cannot trade with. And that's a list that is going to be implemented, actually already has been implemented on March 4th. And that list includes 10 US entities. And again, Chinese companies are prohibited from engaging in import or export activities related to China with these companies. These companies are also prohibited from making new investments in China. And let's see, also for the first time, they actually implemented prohibitions on imports from, well, okay, let me elaborate on this because the wording from the article I used was a little ambiguous. So there are other entities that have already been added to this list. These are American firms again. And they're all Chinese companies are already basically prohibited from trading with them. However, they were not prohibited from buying their products. So for example, if one of these companies sells something and then that product ends up for sale on a secondary market, Chinese consumers could still buy that product. So what's happened now is that the Chinese government has gone beyond just prohibiting purchases directly from these companies. They've prohibited Chinese entities from buying any of their products, even on a secondary market. So they've effectively sanctioned these companies. Now, I tried to find a list of all of the companies themselves so I could figure out what they were. In this case, for this particular list, I actually did find the list. And they are all defense companies. So these are not like private companies engaging in commercial activity. These are all defense companies that are catering to the US military. So you can think of this as as China sanctioning the US military and making it more difficult for the US military to procure items that require inputs of electronics and various other items that are mostly exported by China. So I'll run through the list really quick. The list of companies is Skydio, Brink Drones, Red 6 Solutions, Synexus Inc., Firestorm Labs, Kratos Unmanned Aerial Systems, Havoc AI, Neros Technologies, Domo Tactical Communications, Rapid Flight LLC, and Insitsu Incorporated. So there's another separate list called the Dual Use Export List. And this is basically a list of technologies that have dual uses. In other words, they have both civilian and military uses that Chinese entities can sell abroad if they have a license. So what happened here is that the China's Ministry of Commerce added 16 US entities to this list. Again, the dual use export control list. And let's see, I could not find a list of these. I found a couple of the American companies that are on it. These include High Point Aero Technologies, Universal Logistics Holdings, and Source Intelligence. Couldn't find the rest of the list, but my impression is that these are also defense companies. So once again here, the Chinese government going after the US military. Let's see, the other export control item here that the Chinese government did in retaliation for US tariffs involved rare earths, which were put on an export control list. These were 7 categories of medium and heavy rare earths. And some of the specific ones include samarium, gadolinium, terbium, I'm almost certainly mispronouncing these, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, yttrium. So it's not just the rare earths specifically that are prohibited from sale to US entities. They've also prohibited their sale, they've also prohibited the sale of items that have these as a dominant input. So basically refined versions of these materials. Like I said before, China not only dominates rare earths production, they also dominate the refining of rare earths. So just putting restrictions on the export of rare earths is actually not as impactful as putting restrictions on the export of refined rare earths materials, because those are actually more what they export. Those are the actual inputs that are used to make electronics and other stuff.
Do you think we should brush up on our periodic table with all this rare earth stuff going on?
It's not a bad idea. All those weird ones at the end of the list.
I know, these are not like the common ones that you learn about in science, like iron and helium and stuff like that. It's like, scandium, what? That is a thing. Technically, It is a thing, and some people want it.
Yeah, I thought about trying to kind of learn them and figure out what their commercial uses were, so I would be more familiar with them. But there's a lot, and they generally have more than one use. So it's kind of a heavy lift unless you're really committed to this. Let's see. Oh, by the way, this rare earths export control list, it applies to all countries, not just the United States. And I would point out again that Chinese companies can actually still export this stuff if they have a license. So what's going to happen probably is that they will consider restricting licenses to people or companies that are seeking to export to the US. It's also not clear yet whether or not they'll actually do that. They've actually implemented this kind of licensing regime before. In fact, they did so last year with regard to a couple rare earths which were not that critical for U.S. defense production, U.S. defense production purposes, but they never actually denied any licenses. So there's a question here about whether or not creating the tool implies that they will actually use it. That's not necessarily the case, so we'll see. But they are threatening to do it right now. Let's see. Oh yeah, China's the dominant producer. Yeah, we already talked about that. Okay, another thing they did, they launched an anti-dumping probe into imports of certain medical CT tubes from the US and India. And then they also launched an investigation into DuPont China Group, a subsidiary of the US firm DuPont. The investigation is supposedly into alleged violations of China's anti-monopoly law. For those of you who don't know, DuPont is a major chemical manufacturer in the United States.
I've seen that name on race cars because they do paint stuff.
Yeah, I think they do sponsorships there, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see, all of this drama has also impacted TikTok, of great concern to any teenagers listening. To get you up to date, I don't remember if we talked about this before, but the ban on TikTok was only ever delayed. It was not fully rescinded. And the new deadline was coming up. And what they did is they announced a 75-day additional delay in the ban. And what they're doing is they're trying to negotiate a new ownership group to take ownership of TikTok's US branch. And from what I've read, they were actually pretty close to sealing that deal. And, there's been talk that, Donald Trump would buy TikTok or Elon Musk will buy TikTok. But the details that I've read is basically that the current US shareholders of the US branch of TikTok are basically just going to get a majority share. And it's not even going to be like 80, 90%. They're just going to get a little more so that they're a majority. And oh, by the way, Tencent, I think it is, the Chinese company that created TikTok, they'll still own a lot of shares. It's not going to be a majority anymore, but they will not have to completely divest themselves of TikTok in the United States. So for all of the talk of banning TikTok and selling TikTok, ultimately the solution they're trending towards anyway seems to be just a minor shuffle in terms of who owns what shares in the company. Lots of theater and bullshit in American politics. That's yet another example.
Are these kayfabe power moves?
They don't feel like power moves to me. It seems more like theater, just people doing things so that they can say they're doing things. But here's the thing. After the tariffs were announced, the Chinese government stepped in and announced that the deal would be paused. They said they want to investigate it. And basically, this is Beijing signaling that if the US government doesn't play ball, then they're just going to cancel the deal and TikTok is going to leave the market entirely. Which is an interesting move. Because, of course, everybody assumed that the US government had the leverage in so much as they could ban TikTok. And, of course, the Chinese government didn't want a lucrative branch of one of its companies to basically just be annihilated. Mm-hmm. But now they've stepped in and basically indicated that they are willing to do that if the US government doesn't play ball and that US shareholders are going to get fucked out of their money. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting shift in tone in terms of the debate. We'll see where that goes. It may yet be that TikTok actually does end up leaving the market, but not because of the US government, but because of Beijing. Interesting twist to the story. Oh, ByteDance is the company. Sorry, not Tencent, ByteDance. I had it here in my notes. ByteDance would hold a minority position of under 20%. There you go. Let's see, some diplomacy, also some diplomacy that China has engaged in as part of its retaliation. They've kind of reached out to Europe. They actually delayed one of their anti-dumping investigations into French cognac and Armagnac. And they've also met with European commissioners to discuss ensuring a, quote, level playing field, end quote, which of course has been a major complaint coming out of Europe vis-a-vis China trade. They also announced that they would coordinate with Tokyo and Seoul ahead of the agreement. A lot was made of that at the time. Did we talk about that?
Refresh me?
So South Korea, Japan, China got together and they held a meeting about coordinating a response to any tariffs implemented by the United States. And people kind of inferred that that meant that there would be a united front between them and that they would all stand together against any kind of pressure from the US. That was not the case, as I suspected at the time. A lot of people also got that impression because Beijing released an announcement on its own afterwards, saying that there would be basically unified action on their part and that they would all kind of implement their own retaliation together. And Tokyo and Seoul notably did not release a statement saying that after the meeting. That was Beijing on its own. And I suspect that was Beijing trying to kind of needle not only the United States, but also Tokyo and Seoul. Their way of trying to create a divide between the US and those countries that may not have necessarily existed if not for that announcement. So, of course, Seoul and Tokyo had to kind of reach out to Washington and say, we're kind of talking to them about that, but we're not coordinating with them to nearly that degree. So please do not take that seriously. So yes, they've reached out to coordinate with each other, but there's nothing concrete that's actually been agreed yet. So don't invest too much into that announcement, in other words. But this is all stuff China is doing in order to try to mitigate pressure from the United States on the trade front. Okay, so that's it for retaliation. As you can see, China was just 90% of it. Yeah, they're not optimistic about their chances, so they're going pretty hard. Everybody else is taking more of a wait-and-see approach. Now, the negotiations over new free trade arrangements, those are ongoing, and we don't have a lot of details, but we do have some announcements. So I'm going to try to get through those here.
So would you say China's taking more of a fuck it approach?
I don't think it's a fuck it approach. I think it's a realistic approach because, you know, there are so many officials within the Trump administration that are very hawkish on trade with China that the assumption on the part of Beijing is that they're in the driver's seat and that they're not actually interested in a substantive free trade deal that is something other than extremely favorable to the United States. So much so that it would not be realistic to expect China to actually agree to it. So I guess you could say they're taking a kind of wait-and-see approach, but it's one that's much more antagonistic and that heaps much more pressure on the United States, whereas other partners are kind of more interested in trying to get through this as quickly and quietly as possible. So negotiations. The European Union has offered 0% for 0% tariffs on industrial goods. Sounds good. Washington says no. I guess, again, we don't entirely know what the end state of these negotiations is supposed to be. Earlier, the admin had suggested, even Trump himself had suggested, that a more equal playing field had been the objective. Well, probably a lie, it seems. They have gotten offers to that effect, and they're saying it's not enough. So the European Union's opening offer has been rebuffed on that count. Vietnam, for its part, has offered 0% tariffs on industrial goods as well. And the administration released an announcement saying that that would not be sufficient. They were a little more specific here. They cited non-tariff barriers as being part of the issue. Good luck with that. We'll talk more about why that's a problem later. Let's see. One of Trump's advisors, a guy named Moran, gave a speech at the Hudson Institute, and he actually made recommendations for countries seeking answers as to how they should be approaching the United States in these negotiations. And he says some of the concessions that they might consider making are accepting tariffs without retaliating, buying more American products, investing in US manufacturing, or, quote, simply write checks to the Treasury Department, end quote.
What?
Just give us money. Not really shaking those shakedown accusations that have been made by some critics there. So that's more mixed signaling from the administration. That could just be them trying to look tough and heap pressure in the negotiations, or it could them being serious. Who the fuck knows? Nobody does. So make of that what you will. Let's see. The Trump administration announced recently that they were going to prioritize trade talks with Japan and South Korea. Supposedly that's because they did not retaliate and seem to be making a good faith effort to negotiate. And again, they say that they're trying to make this gives a little more elaboration on the kinds of deals that they're trying to negotiate. They say they want to negotiate a single large deal that encompasses not only trade but other issues. So basically, the administration wants to try to apply leverage in multiple areas all at the same time to try to get as many concessions as possible. That may or may not work. I'm very skeptical. Other nations also have points of leverage beyond trade that they could bring to bear, and those that don't could coordinate with those that do. This is an ongoing game, and the other players are going to respond in ways that are very creative and that try to undermine U.S. leverage. So this is not going to be a series of bilateral negotiations, most likely, unless the United States accepts the most stupid and superficial of concessions, which I kind of personally suspect is what's going to happen. That's actually what's happened in previous trade negotiations. That's what happened in the first term when Trump renegotiated NAFTA, renegotiated the free trade agreement with South Korea. Basically they didn't really get major concessions other than superficial ones that probably aren't going to matter. So I kind of suspect that's what they're going to do here. But, again, we're going to find out. We shall see. Let's see. Also, I had a note here about some leverage that the United States might have in addition to its trade deficit, in so much as that's a point of leverage. Again, we'll talk about that later. One is that the Federal Reserve could end currency swap mechanisms with foreign central banks. Normally, those kinds of mechanisms are only used in emergencies, but taking it away could increase the degree of risk that central banks face should there be another emergency, or even ahead of an emergency, just to kind of increase the baseline level of risk by reducing the supply of dollars overseas. Also, the administration could bar American credit card companies from processing payments abroad. Like I mentioned earlier, American banks hold dominant market share in Europe's payment processing market. What I have here is that MasterCard and Visa process 2/3 of payments in the European Union. I don't imagine those companies would be very happy about such a ban, and I imagine they would try to undermine it as much as possible. But hypothetically, that is something they could do. Something to keep an eye on in the negotiations as they develop. We're nowhere near done.
Here we go.
So like I said, I'm going to go through each of the countries that were tariffed, and I'm going to briefly review what tariffs they got. And it's not going to take that long. Most of them are just 10%, but I wanted to just do it by region to try to illustrate who got hit the hardest and who got hit the least. Did you get that map I sent you?
I can check. Did you send it in Discord?
Yeah, I sent it in your Discord.
Okay.
So basically the numbers I'm going to be reviewing are just reflective of that map. You don't have to look at it just right now, but that's a representation, a visual representation for the visual learners among us of what I'm about to go through here. So Europe, and again, reiterate, this is reciprocal tariffs as announced April the 2nd. And again, these have been delayed except for the 10% minimum. So just to get through them, the European Union, 20%. Norway, 15%. Everybody else, the UK, Iceland, Albania, also 10%. I'm going to start here with American allies, by the way. So this isn't going to be an exact geographic order. So American allies in Europe, EU 20%, Norway 15%, UK 10%, Iceland, Albania also 10%. In the Middle East, Israel actually got 17%, which surprised the fuck out of Israel because the Israeli government announced in the week previous that they had already, not announcing ahead of time, but had just already done it, dropped tariffs on American goods to 0%.
Oh, they were just being nice to us.
Specifically to try to avoid tariffs. And the Trump admin just didn't care, and they got 17 anyway. Let's see, in Oceania, Australia, New Zealand both got 10%. In Asia, Taiwan, and Asia got hit hard. Taiwan, 32%. South Korea, 25%. Japan, 24%. Philippines, 17%. And South Korea got the 25% in spite of having a free trade agreement with the United States, and also in spite of the average effective tariff that South Korea imposes on the United States being a whopping 0.79%. Again, these are not reciprocal tariffs, in case you needed any more evidence. Latin America, everybody got 10%, except Cuba, which I guess doesn't count because we're sanctioning them. And I had a note here that a number of countries in the region have free trade agreements with the United States, specifically under the CAFTA-DR agreement, and these 10% tariffs just violate it openly. Also, a fun fact, the United States has a trade surplus with both Argentina and Brazil. And Brazil, for its part, has an average effective tariff on US goods of 6%. Doesn't matter, still got 10% tariffs. Okay, going beyond American allies, China and various markets that have enjoyed re-exports from China to the United States, all of them got hit hard. Cambodia, 49%, Laos, 48%, Vietnam, 46%, Thailand, 36%, China itself, 34%, although that stacked with previous tariff. That stacked with previous tariffs, so effectively the tariff was over 50% after the announcement of reciprocal tariffs. Malaysia, 24%. So again, all of these countries besides China generally have a lot of Chinese investment and have Chinese companies that either produce goods that are exported to the United States, or they receive goods produced in China that are then modified and then exported on to the United States to evade American tariffs on China. So hence the large trade deficit the United States has with these countries, and correspondingly the high tariffs that the Trump administration imposed on them. Other countries in Southeast Asia, Burma, 44% for some reason, Indonesia, 32%, Brunei, 24%, and then Singapore and East Timor, both 10%. South Asia, Sri Lanka, 44%. Really got it in for Sri Lanka, apparently. Bangladesh, 37%, Pakistan, 29%, India, 26%. And then Nepal and, bizarrely, Afghanistan both got 10%. Maldives and Bhutan also 10%. Afghanistan is especially weird because on the chart they released, the average effective tariffs for Afghanistan were listed as 49%. So going by their rule, the American reciprocal tariff for Afghanistan should have been about 25%, half of the effective average tariff on US imports. Afghanistan was the only country on that chart in which the American reciprocal tariff was not half of the average effective tariff that was listed. I have no idea why. I assume it was an error. It kind of made me wonder about the theory that the chart was actually generated by AI. There was actually a conspiracy theory going around on social media about that. Evidence is not entirely contrary to that, and the Afghanistan error kind of makes me wonder. Regardless, Afghanistan, for whatever fucking reason, got 10%. Make of that what you will. Europe, these are countries that are not treaty allies of the United States and Europe, which is why I didn't mention them in the earlier list. So Switzerland got 31%, which was very confusing for the Swiss because they actually have an open trade policy and recently abolished all industrial tariffs, including on goods from the United States, which is also its largest export market. Despite this fact, still got 31% tariffs. Again, not reciprocal. Ukraine, 10%. Balkans got hit weirdly hard. Serbia, 37%. Bosnia, 35%. Macedonia, 33%. Moldova, 31%. Kosovo and Montenegro, 10%. Now, again, like I mentioned earlier, the reciprocal tariffs, as announced, are actually calculated based off of the American trade deficit with these countries. So the higher the American trade deficit, the higher the tariff the U.S. imposed on them. I was really surprised to hear that Balkans countries had large trade surpluses with the U.S. because I really have no idea what they've been exporting. So I actually took the initiative and looked that up, and I have a brief list for each of what they're exporting to give you an idea of what we're dealing with here. So for Serbia, their leading exports to the United States are rubber tires, mattresses, and explosive ammunition. Explosive ammunition makes sense. The U.S. has been trying to scale up ammunition production, partly for its own purposes, but also partly to help Ukraine. So some of the United States had basically kind of significantly curtailed its ability to make explosives and ammunition after the end of the Cold War. So we've been importing to try to make up the shortfall as we've scaled up our own production. So apparently the Balkans is a major source for that. To give you exact numbers here, the total value of rubber tires exports to the United States from Serbia, $121 million. Mattress exports 51 million, explosive ammunition 48.4 million. Pretty small numbers in the grand scheme of things. These are not like big exports we're talking. Bosnia, main export to the United States, explosive ammunition, $41.6 million. Rubber footwear, 13.5 million. Mattresses, 11.2 million. Lots of mattresses for some reason. Macedonia, main export to the US is buses, 203 million. Also raw tobacco, 11.2 million. And also motor vehicles, parts, and accessories. That's a classification, and it's actually just car parts. So car parts, $8.89 million. And then Moldova, for its part, mostly exports fruit juice to the United States, $27.8 million. And then also insulated wire, $9.32 million. So for those of you curious, that's why they have trade surpluses. Also, they just, being small, poor markets, don't really import much inherently, hence the trade deficit. Okay, Caucasus countries, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, all 10%. Mini states, I really had to do research on this one. Liechtenstein got 37%. Why? So I looked it up, and apparently they do have a trade surplus with the United States. I couldn't believe it when I read it. It's not much, like the total volume is obviously very small, but mainly it's just that Liechtenstein companies, these are companies that are basically chartered in Liechtenstein, technically export their stuff under their own flag, Liechtenstein, but produce it kind of elsewhere. So Liechtenstein itself is just too tiny to actually produce a lot of stuff. But their companies do produce some, and their exports to the United States are precision tools, dental pads, and also precious metals. So fuck Liechtenstein, I guess. That seems to be the policy in Washington. San Marino, Monaco, Andorra all got 10%. There were a couple missing countries in the list as well. I'll talk a little bit about them. In the case of Europe, Russia, Belarus, and the Vatican were not on the big chart. Russia and Belarus was explained because they had sanctions. The Vatican, I'm guessing they just didn't give a shit about, which at least makes sense. Credit for making sense for once. Africa, cut Africa into specific regions. Southern Africa, very particularly hit hard here. Lesotho, 50%. 50% is actually the highest on the chart, by the way. Lesotho got fucked.
What did they do to us?
Madagascar, what?
What did they do to us? It's just the trade deficit there?
Yeah, they export a lot of jeans to the United States.
Oh, man.
The United States has a special arrangement with Africa because it's so undeveloped, wherein they get special trade privileges. And so some textiles manufacturers took advantage of that and set up jeans production in Lesotho. But because Lesotho is so poor and small, they don't import hardly anything. And so the result is that they actually have a fairly large trade surplus with the United States because of their jeans exports, and because of that, 50% tariffs. Madagascar, 47%, Botswana, 37%, Angola, 32%, South Africa, 30%, Namibia, 21%, Zimbabwe, 18%, Zambia, 17%, Mozambique, 16%, Eswatini, 10%. Now, if you're curious about some of the exports in these other places, which I didn't know about either, and I took the liberty of looking them up, I'll briefly go through them so you can get an idea of why these countries have trade surpluses with the United States. Madagascar, major vanilla exporter. So all of your ice cream that has vanilla in it, a lot of that is made using vanilla extract imported from Madagascar. Madagascar also exports to the United States a lot of apparel, titanium, cobalt, nickel. Commodities like that, heavy metals, that's going to be a recurring theme. Botswana exports a lot of diamonds, synthetic reconstructed jewelry stones, and weirdly spark ignition engines. I would not think that engine production would be a main manufacturing item in Botswana, but apparently it is. Angola, totally predictable. They're just a major oil exporter, and the United States imports a good amount. South Africa apparently exports cars, platinum, and other precious metals to the U.S. Namibia, just raw resources. Zimbabwe, also mostly raw resources, specifically ferroalloys, raw tobacco, and raw sugar. and very small volume there, by the way. The largest is ferroalloys, and that's only $62 million. And then Zambia is precious stones, refined copper, and coffee. Mozambique, precious stones, titanium ore, graphite. So mostly just stuff you dig out of the ground for the most part. A few refined items here and there. West Africa. So the entirety of West Africa got 10%, except Cote d'Ivoire, and except Nigeria and Chad. Those are the three exceptions out of the entirety of West Africa. Nigeria, for its part, is a major oil exporter, no surprise. Chad apparently also exports oil. That surprised me. I didn't think Chad produced much of anything, so I was surprised to find out that they were actually exporting oil to the U.S. Ivory Coast, for its part, is a major exporter of chocolate, specifically the cocoa that chocolate is made from, and that's the main reason for their trade surplus with the U.S. Central Africa, everybody's 10% except Equatorial Guinea at 13, Cameroon at 11, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo at 11 as well. And all of those, DRC, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, are because of oil. Great Lakes region, this is the Great Lakes region of Africa, for those not familiar with it. Everybody got 10% except Malawi, and that's because they export raw tobacco, tea, and raw sugar. Horn of Africa, everybody got 10%, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia. Somalia didn't make the list. It kind of makes sense since it's a failed state. They almost don't have a government, so I don't entirely blame the advent for leaving them off, but they are technically missing from the list.
Do you think people are going to move their businesses to these countries to avoid these tariffs?
I think you mean to the U.S.?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, probably not. We'll talk about that later. I got a whole impact section set up. Let's see. Oh, West Africa, on the big chart, there were two countries missing. One of them was Mauritania, the other Burkina Faso. There was a newer list that was published a couple days after the initial announcement. It actually did have Mauritania, and they were also at 10%, like most of the rest of West Africa. However, Burkina Faso is still missing. Presumably, there's 10% tariffs that were applied to them, but it hasn't appeared on any official listing yet, near as I can tell. So apparently, to the Trump administration, Burkina Faso doesn't exist. Make of that what you will. Latin America, everybody's at 10% except for three. Guyana got 38, Nicaragua got 18, Venezuela got 15. Venezuela, obviously a major oil exporter. Not entirely sure why Nicaragua. I think their main export is beef, if I'm not mistaken. So apparently that's grounds for a trade surplus. I would keep in mind having a trade surplus doesn't just mean you export a lot. It can also just be the result of not importing much, which with a developing country is often the case, since you just don't have that large a consumer base. Guyana, for its part, that's just oil and natural gas. Let's see, Middle East and North Africa. Turkey got 10%. In North Africa, Libya 31%. That's oil. Algeria 30%, oil and natural gas. Tunisia got 28%. That actually really surprised me because Tunisia is not a major exporter of pretty much any kind of commodity that I'm aware of. So I looked up what they export to the U.S. Pure olive oil is their lead export to the U.S. About $218 million worth. And I think 2023 is what the numbers, or where the numbers I got came from. They also export mixed mineral or chemical fertilizers. That's $104 million. And then some crude petroleum, about $56.9 million worth, which is not very much. Egypt, Sudan, Morocco, 10%. They did not list Western Sahara for whatever reason. Maybe because the government basically just wants to pretend that Morocco controls all of it. That's an ongoing territorial dispute. So I don't entirely blame them for leaving them out. In the Gulf, Iraq got 39%. And, being an oil exporter, I guess I expected it to be higher than 10, but 39 seems very high. And it's especially weird just for geopolitical reasons, because while Iraq got 39%, Iran got 10.
What?
Yeah, they got okay. Cuba's not on the list, or Belarus or Russia, because we're sanctioning them, right? That was the logic given. But we're also sanctioning Iran, and Iran is on the list, and they're only getting 10%, which is much lower than Iraq, which is a country that the United States is struggling to influence. Not only is it struggling to influence it, but it's specifically competing with Iran for influence in Iraq, and Iran got the lower tariff. It makes no sense to me. Very strange. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar all got 10%. In the Levant, Syria got 41%. That almost seems just spiteful. Apparently, they exported $11 million worth of stuff to the US in 2023. And because it's a war-torn country, they haven't really had any economy to speak of in a long time. So, of course, they're not really importing much. So because of that, 41%. Lebanon and Jordan, 10%. On the peninsula, Oman and Yemen both got 10%. Oceania, oh man, it's about to get weird, Neuro, so buckle up. So
It's
in
been
Oceania,
weird.
Fiji got 32%. And apparently that's on the back of exports of bottled water, gold, textiles, and kava. Nauru, which is a tiny island country, by the way, 30%, mostly on the back of phosphate exports. Vanuatu, 22%. Apparently they export a lot of perfume plants. Marshall Islands got 10%. Also Micronesia. Palau was not on the original list, but they were on the updated list at 10%. Very weird to me that Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau are on the list for 10%, because the United States has a compact of free association with all three countries. And that compact basically involves the United States being responsible for their foreign policies and defense, basically in exchange for certain benefits like the right to travel freely to the United States and also free access to the US market. So, what we have with these island countries is even closer than a free trade agreement. It is kind of a de facto union. And despite this fact, they're getting 10% tariffs. That seems very self-defeating to me. Not only for those reasons, but also because the United States really had to go out of its way to renegotiate all of those compacts of free association fairly recently, because they actually expired a few years ago. And that led to some consternation. China was making plays in Oceania at the time. Maybe some people remember the drama in Solomon Islands. They've also been making plays in Kiribati. There's been geopolitics happening in the region. And so some people were very nervous. And so the impulse was to try to play very nice and to try to appeal to these countries. Again, specifically Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Palau. And they were able to successfully renegotiate the agreements. But even so, it still makes sense to try to stay on their good side so that we can maintain our position in the Pacific, which is kind of anchored in those three countries. Also, obviously anchored in Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines, etc. But beyond that, our position in Oceania specifically is anchored in those three island countries. So aggravating them does not seem very strategic, and that seems to be what we're doing. Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Cook Island, Tuvalu, Kiribati, 10% each. Tonga, for whatever reason, was not on the original list, but they were on the updated list. So they're at 10% as well. Caribbean, 10% across the board. And then it gets even weirder. British overseas territories, the Falkland Islands got 41%.
Haven't they been through enough?
They export a lot of frozen fish, apparently especially something called toothfish. And extra fun fact, the Falkland Islands have 0 tariffs on any good from anywhere in the world.
Oh, no.
Except for tobacco and alcohol.
Sorry, Falkland Islands.
Yeah, they're kind of getting slammed here because the only thing they have to export is fish. And of course, they're too small to export anything, so they get extra screwed. Other British overseas territories all got 10%. There were some that did not appear on the original list, but did appear on the updated list. Those are also 10%. French overseas territories. Saint Pierre and Miquelon, 50%. For those of you who don't know these islands, which is probably most people, Saint Pierre and Miquelon is the last vestige of the French Empire in North America. Basically, they used to control all of Quebec, the Mississippi River Basin, the Great Lakes. They lost the 7 Years' War in the mid-1700s and had to give all of it up. But the one concession from the British is that they were able to keep 2 islands that are just off the coast of Newfoundland. And those are St. Pierre and Miquelon. And they now have to pay, they're now subject to 50% tariffs. And the reason they have a surplus with the United States is just because of seafood, specifically lobster is what I read. Now, important thing to note here is that after the administration started getting a lot of shit for some of these like random overseas territories getting very high tariffs, they actually did return to the list and adjust it. So St. Pierre and Miquelon actually now is subject to 10% tariffs, not 50%, as it was with the initial list. Same thing happened with Réunion Island, another French overseas territory. Initially, they were at 37%. Once the list was changed, it went down to 10. All other French overseas territories also at 10%. I would point out here that it's not entirely unreasonable for the United States to have individual tariffs for overseas territories, because these individual territories do have their own tariff regimes that are separate from those of their mother countries. Australian external territories. These are the ones that Reddit has been having fun with. So Norfolk Island, 29%. This is one of the ones that was corrected downwards a few days later to 10%. Christmas Island, 10%. Heard and McDonald Island, 10%. That one in particular got the administration some laughs because that one's uninhabited. Yeah, the joke is that they were tariffing penguins because apparently that's the main animal that lives there.
Oh, penguins.
And then the Cocoa Islands, 10%. Norwegian overseas territories. Svalbard and Jan Mayen, 10%. Dutch overseas territories. Curacao, Aruba, St. Martin, all 10%. I noted that Bonaire was missing from the list. That's another Dutch overseas territory. Apparently they don't count. Not sure what that's about. New Zealand external territory, Tokelau, 10%. I thought New should be on that list, but then I looked into it, and apparently they actually are more like the Cook Islands in that they're technically independent, but have a compact of free association agreement with New Zealand. So they have the same relationship with New Zealand, basically, that Marshall Islands, Palau, and Micronesia has with the United States. So that's the full list.
It, to me, it feels weird, and I think some of your reactions are based on we are kind of randomly punishing certain allies who are close to us and either not punishing or rewarding enemies of us. So it's not really cohesive in terms of, okay, this feels like we're making a strong move at the people who have been threatening us and making a favorable move to people who have been favorable to us. We're sort of punishing good people and bad people and abstaining from punishing some bad people if tariffs are indeed a thing that you don't want and that are bad for you.
I mean, that's what happens when you just have a single rule that is extremely simplistic that you apply to everybody all at the same time.
Yeah, it's inherently.
Like, again, they just had like a very basic. Yeah.
There was no like one oversight committee who said, okay, so for these contingency cases, we're going to adjust the number because of our relationship with the country or insert reason here. It's just like plug in the algorithm. Okay, go. Now these are the tariffs that we're applying to everybody based on this formula that we set. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. And again, it's based entirely on the trade deficit. So they didn't take into consideration extenuating circumstances like strategy, geopolitics, other economic factors. Just it makes sense only if they're doing this to try to lean on countries to get some kind of concessions. And again, we don't know what those are. We don't know what the desired concessions are. I'm still of the mind, given the administration's past track record, that they don't have any particular concessions in mind and that they're just waiting to see what's presented to them. We shall see, one way or the other. But it's just very goofy for all of the reasons outlined. And if you needed any further evidence that the tariffs are not reciprocal, I found an article by CNBC that actually did look up the real effective average tariffs that these countries apply against goods imported from the United States and compared them to the ones listed by the chart that was produced by the United States government. And as you can guess, massive divergence. They didn't list all of the countries, but they listed about 24. The administration says Cambodia has 97% tariffs against US goods. Actually, it's 7.9% on average. Lesotho, 99%, actually 10.6%. I could go through the whole list like this. It's the same. Fiji, the admin said 63%. In reality, it's 10%. Sri Lanka, 88%, according to the US government. In reality, 7.5%. What you'll find is that almost all of them are under 10. For all of the talk about other countries are tariffing the United States and it's only fair if we tariff them at an equal level, well, the tariffs were already low. It's not like that heavy a burden that the United States was facing in these export markets. You know, free trade agreements had already gotten them pretty low. And in the cases where they might be relatively high, like in Guyana, it was 13%, Tunisia, 14.4%. Like in those cases, you could probably negotiate a free trade agreement with those places that negotiated it down properly to what you wanted. This giant blanket approach, it feels like the priority is more the theatrics than the substance, which is why I'm so dubious about it.
It's a crazy shotgun approach.
Yeah.
Of nuking the problem rather than, okay, what are the countries that we need to create a show of force against? How can we like put pressure on them versus putting pressure on people who have in good faith tried to make good dealings with you in the past? We're just punishing you all randomly, basically, is what it feels like.
Well, it's not random. Again, they chose the formula specifically because of the trade deficits, and that's something that Trump himself has harped on in the past. He, whatever other objectives he may have, genuinely seems to believe that if the United States is importing more from a country than it's exporting, that this is unfair and that it represents a point of leverage that the United States government can use to try to extract some kind of concessions from those countries. That seems to be the underlying logic here. So it's not entirely random or crazy. There is some sense to it. But again, like I said, that underlying logic, that trade deficits are bad and a point of leverage we can use, that's actually very flawed thinking. And I'm going to criticize that if and when we get to the criticism section. How are we doing on time?
We are 2 hours in.
2 hours? Oh, right. Wait, are we? I thought we started at 8. No, we started later, right? You said 8:40, right? Okay. So we still have another hour.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about what exactly the United States has done in terms of tariffs on everybody, but then also more specifically cars. I've detailed exactly what tariffs have been implemented or were threatened to be implemented anyway against specific countries. And so now I want to shift and talk about the impact of these tariffs. This is going to be forecasting because, again, for the most part, these tariffs haven't come to pass. Thus far, we've only seen the 10% baseline applied. The actual tariffs that are higher than that have been delayed for 90 days. And it's not clear if that maybe wasn't the plan from the start. Maybe the tariffs higher than 10% were just meant to scare other countries. And they always intended to delay them later once they got everybody to the negotiating table. That's kind of a goofy, immature way to do that, but whatever. That's the administration's MO. That's how they like to do it. So, based off of the 10% based off of the 10% baseline tariffs, and then assuming that the higher tariffs come later, I'm going to make some forecasts here about what impacts are going to look like. And I'm going to speak pretty generically, so I'm not going to say specifically what will happen because nobody knows, and I'm just one guy, so it's not like I'm going to be able to forecast out all of the thousands of goods that are made in a $100 trillion global economy. That's not happening. But I just wanted to give a general idea of what certain categories and some specific goods in those categories are going to be doing. What specifically their prices are going to be doing. And the impacts I'm going to talk about first are primary impacts. These are primary effects. This is going to be specifically the most direct fallout from the tariffs in terms of prices and production. Let's see here. So yeah, to start with, again, speaking generically, I'm going to talk a little bit about an index I drew up to give you, the listener, an idea of kind of how to do this yourself. This is going to be a rough guide. Because obviously everybody's familiar, well, if you've ever taken an intro to economics class, you're probably roughly familiar with some of the basic discourse in economics about trade and some of the effects I'll be talking about. You might be less familiar with some of the more obscure stuff. I'll kind of get into that. But basically, there's three things that are going to happen with a lot of these goods, specifically with the companies that produce these goods. One, the tariffs are going to force them to dig into their own profits to avoid changing their price. Two, they're going to take all of that excess cost from tariffs and they're going to push it onto their suppliers. So what that means is that their suppliers are going to charge less for their product. And that's how they'll basically redistribute the cost of the tariffs. The other thing they can do is push the cost of the tariff onto consumers. So in other words, they'll just raise their price. So if 100% of the cost of their product is from imports and there's 10% tariff on imports, they'll raise the price by 10% to pay for the tariff tax. So those are the three options, and which of them a given company is going to do is going to depend on different factors. And I kind of went through and tried to game out a couple of companies, a couple product types, a couple industries. And what I found is that I was kind of returning to three items specifically each time. So instead of doing like some insane unmanageable case study or series of case studies, I just created a function. And then you yourself, if you're curious about a given product, can kind of use this function as a rough rule of thumb to figure out which of the three choices a given company is going to go with. And I can't guarantee this will always be accurate, but again, just a rough rule of thumb, just to kind of get an idea of how the costs of tariffs will be redistributed, whether they'll be inflationary for consumers or are going to undermine the profitability of producers or producer suppliers. So the first thing to look at, it's a three-part function. Basically, the first thing to look at is price elasticity of demand. If you don't know what that is, that's basically just the sensitivity of demand for a product to changes in the price of that product. So take oil, for example. Demand for oil is actually pretty fixed. It doesn't necessarily change that much because it's an important input for many, many things. So the price can jack up quite a lot, or it can collapse downward quite a bit. But in general, the actual quantity of oil demanded after those changes is not that great. So that's what's called price inelastic. The price elasticity of demand for oil is inelastic. For the math nerds, that's in this case less than 1. If a good that is being sold in the United States is sensitive to imports and in turn tariffs on imports, if the price elasticity of demand for that good is inelastic, like oil, then odds are the seller of that good is going to be able to just pass the cost of the tariff on to consumers without worrying about changes in their revenue. They'll lose a little bit, but just like with oil revenue, just like with oil sellers, their overall level of revenue isn't going to necessarily change all that much. They'll be able to survive a relatively small increase. Well, they'll be able to survive an increase in price. And again, going back to the oil example, when oil prices rise, that actually represents a pretty good increase in revenue for them. Because normally when prices increase, demand falls. That's basic economics. But in the case of a good that has an inelastic price elasticity of demand, even as the price falls, the demand doesn't fall enough to kind of counterbalance it proportionately. And so your revenue actually still ends up kind of ahead of the game. So in the circumstances with tariffs, you're not really getting the benefit of revenues. You're still going to lose money because you're, unlike oil with natural market increases in price from tariffs are a tax, and the excess money that you're taking in from the price increase, that's going to the government instead. So you still lose money. But if the demand isn't really changing that much, it's not going to be that bad of a hit. So in that sense, purveyors of these types of goods are going to be okay. And tariffs on these kinds of goods will be inflationary. So that's the first part of the function. Second part of the function, average profit margins. This one is pretty intuitive. If a given business has high profit margins, they can more ably absorb the cost of a tariff into their profits rather than passing it on to either their consumers or to their suppliers. They can just eat that themselves. Doesn't mean they inevitably will, but they have that as an option. And if they're in a market that's very price sensitive, where they want to avoid price increases at all costs, they're likely to do that if they have high profit margins. Although the correlation between firms in very competitive markets and firms with high profit margins is pretty low. Generally, if you're in a competitive market, your margins are pretty narrow. But in the few cases where it might be otherwise, they'll just absorb the tariff cost. So that's the second part of the function. Third part of the function, market concentration. So if you have more market power, you can probably divert the cost of the tariffs onto others. However, market power doesn't just depend on the producer, it also depends on the supplier and to a degree also on the consumer. Actually didn't put the market, it's basically, it's a three-part function here. Market concentration for producer, consumer, supplier. I know it's weird to say market concentration consumer, but there actually are some consumers that have monopsony power. Like Walmart is the biggest example I can think of off the top of my head. They're such a large buyer that they actually have monopsonistic power that gives them great leverage in their negotiations with suppliers. So between the three, whoever has the most market concentration relative to the other two is the least likely to have to absorb the cost of the tariffs. Whoever has the least market concentration of the three is the most likely to end up having to absorb them. Again, if you have market concentration, you have what is in effect monopolistic power or monopsonistic power, and you can leverage that against your suppliers and consumers to basically force them to eat those costs from tariffs. So I know that's a lot to take in for people who maybe haven't done economics in a while, but if you want to look at an individual industry and want to figure out how the cost of tariffs are going to be redistributed, this is basically the three-part thing you're going to be looking at. Price elasticity of demand, average profit margins, and then the market concentrations amongst the different actors in that market: producers, suppliers, consumers. So with that rule of thumb out of the way, let's look at some specific examples. And I added the caveat in my notes here. Like I mentioned earlier, inventories have been built up over the past 6 months. So the actual effects that I'm going to be talking about may never happen if the tariff drama is resolved before inventories run out, or if they do happen, won't actually manifest in prices until midsummer or so, when inventories are expected to run out. So you're not going to see these impacts in the short term, but you will see them eventually if the tariff thing goes the distance. So I'm going to start with the primary market. This is generally stuff like food, raw resources of one kind or another, etc. So bananas are going to get more expensive. The United States imports a lot of bananas from Central America. They all got the 10% tariffs. Fruit in general also will be more expensive. The US imports a lot from Latin America more broadly, and especially imports a lot for fruit that is out of season in the Northern Hemisphere. Keep in mind one of the revolutions that, keep in mind one of the big benefits of the revolution in logistics that we've experienced with globalization over the past couple decades is that all kinds of fruit are available all year round. Because refrigeration ships are so advanced and fast now that you can efficiently import fruit that is out of season in your hemisphere from a grower in another hemisphere where it's in season before that fruit goes bad. That's pretty incredible. But what that means is that fruit that's out of season in the Northern Hemisphere is particularly sensitive to tariffs, because like the vast majority of supply of that fruit is invariably going to be imported. So 10% on out of season fruits, basically, almost across the board. So that's going to get more expensive.
Oh, no.
I would point out that 10% does not mean a lot more expensive. So if it's like $10 for something, if the full cost of the tariffs is passed on to the consumer, 10% means that you're going to pay an extra $1. So not that much in the grand scheme of things, although that does add up over time. You know, if you are buying something repeatedly across a year, 10% can add up pretty quickly. And as we'll see, there's definitely more expensive items for which the tariff hit is going to be more substantive. Next item, pastries, they'll be more expensive. That's, again, just a fruit thing. Fruit is a major ingredient for a lot of pastries. So in so much as fruit gets more expensive, pastries in turn also. Chocolate and chocolate candy will get more expensive. Like I mentioned, West Africa is a major source of chocolate, or more accurately, cocoa, you know, the main ingredient in chocolate. Also, a lot of chocolate candy is also imported from Switzerland. And both of those territories have been tariffed. Switzerland in particular got tariffs in excess of 30%. West Africa got 10% across the board, except for the largest chocolate exporter, Ivory Coast, which got, 30 or so percent. So your chocolate in turn is going to be more expensive. And it's already been getting more expensive just because of things like climate change and changes in some of the market apparatus in West Africa. That gets a little in the weeds. It's kind of interesting if you're interested in market mechanisms, but I'll save that for another conversation. But basically, chocolate has actually gone up something like 300% over the past couple of years, specifically because there have been restrictions on supply, both naturally and artificially. So another 10% on top of that is not that much. You know, if you haven't noticed the inflation in chocolate items over the past couple of years, you're probably not going to notice it now because of these tariffs. But the tariffs will have an inflationary effect in general on imports of chocolate and imports of goods that have chocolate in it, specifically those from Switzerland. Let's see. Probably a lot of people don't drink tea from Sri Lanka or from South Asia more generally, but for those of you who do, it's about to get more expensive if the tariffs do go through. At the very least, the 10% is already in place, so tea imported from India, Sri Lanka, and China is already more expensive. But especially if the excess tariffs go into effect, like the higher tariffs on India, I think it was 23% in the reciprocal tariff chart, and then something like 44% for Sri Lanka, tea imported from those places will especially be getting expensive. China's already subject to, 149% tariffs, so tea from there is already is more than twice as expensive as it used to be, much to my regret. Very frustrating. I've had tea sent to me by friends in China before, and I resent having to pay more for it.
So there's a bit of a debate in the chat of whether tariffs are inflationary or deflationary.
Okay, that gets into secondary effects, and I am actually getting two secondary effects. In general, they are inflationary because they are a tax, and as a tax, they will make things more expensive. Some of the secondary effects of a trade war can be deflationary on certain types of goods. So what can happen, for example, and this is what's going to happen, I'm going to talk about this when we get to secondary effects. One of the effects of the trade war is that other countries are going to retaliate against U.S. agriculture, which means that U.S. agricultural producers are going to lose market share abroad. So what happens to all of the food that they were going to sell abroad? Well, they're going to sell it in the United States instead, or to other places. And what that means is that there's going to be an increase in supply of food in the short term in the United States. That will actually be deflationary. That will reduce the cost of those items. Now, again, this is going to be stuff that the U.S. had been exporting. So, for example, wheat. The U.S. is a major wheat exporter. Losing market share overseas means then that more wheat produced in the United States will be redirected here, and in turn, the price of wheat will fall, and by extension, the price of wheat derivative products will fall. So, for example, bread will be cheaper. So yes, there are some secondary effects which are deflationary. However, this is indirect, and it's going to vary a lot depending on the composition of your economy. For example, if you export a lot to the United States, you'll probably see much more of this effect. China, for example, exports a lot to the United States, is getting hit with very high tariffs. What's going to happen is that a lot of those manufactured goods are going to reverberate away from the United States and into other markets, including China, which will have a deflationary effect in those places, which could actually be good because it means cheaper manufactured stuff. But it's actually bad for manufacturers in those places because now they have cheaper competition, which could undermine them in terms of industrial priorities, deindustrialization, stuff like that. We talked a little bit about this the last time we talked, when we talked about steel tariffs. I mentioned that one of the effects of US steel and aluminum tariffs is that a lot of steel would be redirected away from the United States into places like Europe, and that Europe was planning to implement higher tariffs on steel to account for that. That's a secondary effect, and it's the kind of unintended consequence that sometimes gets overlooked if you're not planning ahead, which of course Washington is not doing right now. So again, I'll get deeper into secondary effects later, but for now, I'm just going through primary effects. And because tariffs are almost always inflationary, just by their nature, almost all of the items I'm going to be listing here are items that are going to go up in price, specifically because they are directly affected by tariffs. Let's see. Okay, so that's it for the primary sector stuff. Secondary sector. For those who don't know, secondary sector refers to manufacturing of various kinds, and I have this cut up into subcategories just for simplicity's sake. So light manufacturing, cosmetics will be more expensive. Indonesia is a major producer of palm oil, and palm oil is a major ingredient in many cosmetics. So that should go up in price. And there's no viable alternative stateside, so that's probably just going to be permanent. You know, we can't really grow lots of palm oil, or certainly not enough to replace all we're importing. I don't think even in the long term. So this would be a structural increase in the price of palm oil. Luxury watches, for those of you who care about that, those will be more expensive. The US imports a lot from Switzerland. And as we've discussed before, you know, when a major competitor raises their price, that generally causes other competitors to do the same. They won't rise by as much, but they will rise enough to get bigger profits while still being lower than the competitor that initiated the price rise so that they can steal their market share. So even if only Swiss watches are technically going up in price, the effect on the broader market should hypothetically be inflationary. Okay, clothes. Bangladesh, Vietnam, China, all major textiles exporters, all of them hit with at least 10%, in China's case, a lot more than 10%. So the textiles market is going to get roiled here. Not entirely clear. I mean, for one, clothes will be more expensive. That's obviously the main takeaway. You know, if you buy shirts, jackets, whatever it is you're buying, it's going to be a little more expensive at least going forward, potentially a lot, if the 40% plus tariffs on Vietnam go forward, as they were initially announced. I think Bangladesh also got 30 to 40% in the initial announcement. So if they end up seeing those, that would also be very disruptive. 10% is not as disruptive, but in the textiles industry, it's actually still a problem because that industry really survives on, basically lives or dies on very narrow profit margins. And so a 10% increase, while mild, actually does fuck up their business model somewhat badly. And a lot of them are having to really scramble to figure out how to adapt to the new circumstances. So probably one of the, not to get too ahead of myself, but one of the secondary effects here is that there's probably going to be a resorting of the textiles industry, specifically the geography of textile manufacturing. Again, this is presumptuous of me because it assumes that the tariffs are going to stick around for a while, and we don't know. Like, they could, the Trump administration could scrap this whole thing once it has enough concessions of one kind or another. And so we could end up looking exactly we could end up with tariffs being exactly what they were before all of this started. Basically, that is one of the outcomes that markets have to take into consideration, and it's one of the things that's paralyzing them because they just don't know where things are going to go. But if we do assume that the tariffs are going to stick around, textiles firms are almost certainly going to diversify away from Bangladesh and Vietnam, especially China, more so than they already were. So you can look forward to buying your clothes from, in future, sub-Saharan Africa, I guess. There's a couple different regions that I saw mentioned, and I'll talk a little more about those when we get to secondary effects. I did note that there were some small brands that said that they would reshore to the United States. These are small-time producers that have somewhat higher margins. But interestingly, they said that when they reshored to the United States, they would be reshoring to factories in Los Angeles and New York City, which I thought
some of
was
the most
very
expensive
interesting.
places in the country.
Yeah, those are very expensive, and it's also interesting because nominally, in so much as reshoring manufacturing is an actual goal here, which again is very debatable, but if it's a goal, presumably they want more of the manufacturing to go to the Rust Belt, back to those areas that were deindustrialized so that the people there can get some of those factory jobs back. That's not really a thing most places there need, but nominally that's the logic. That is the widespread perception in the United States, that those places are poverty-stricken hellscapes that don't have any jobs and that they need their factory jobs back if they want to get back on their feet. And instead, this seems to be an early sign that that's not going to happen, even in the few cases where they do see some reshoring. It seems that at least in the case of niche producers in the textiles industry, LA and New York City are actually pretty good choices. And again, I don't think that's what the Trump admin has in mind for reshoring. So interesting case study. It's just one independent example. It's not necessarily representative, but I thought it was interesting. Shoes, similar to clothes, a huge chunk of shoes imported into the United States are imported from Vietnam. But the note I have here is that about half of all Nike brand shoes and 39% of Adidas brand shoes are made in Vietnam. So shoemakers in the United States are especially on the brink here because they invested pretty heavily in Vietnam the last time Trump was in power, when there was a falling out between the US and China, and they figured Vietnam was a safer bet. And now Vietnam potentially could be subject to 40+% tariffs. At the very least, is subject to 10% tariffs at the moment. So clothes and shoes will become more expensive, at least a little bit. Miscellaneous items. And this is still light manufacturing, by the way. All right, this is just going to be a quick list of some light manufacturing items that are going to get more expensive because of tariffs. Medical devices, sensors, toys, electrical equipment, furniture, cookware, cutlery, and tools. And I want to elaborate, when I say electrical equipment, I'm not talking about electronics. I'm talking about equipment relevant to the production and distribution of electricity. So like power lines, cables for power lines, well, I guess that's what power lines are. Power lines, all of the equipment you need. I'm blanking out on the names of the actual equipment, but I think smart people in chat already know. I want to call it a router, but that's not what it is. Transformer, I think that's one. You get stuff like that. China is actually a major producer of electrical equipment of that variety. And so in so much as the United States still imports a lot of that, it's going to get more expensive. Although I would point out, too, there has been a shift away from Chinese producers in the U.S. market over time. So the effect might be muted. But as I've mentioned before, the effect is going to be inflationary on the U.S. market as a whole. You know, competitors are going to raise prices in response to this as well. So that will be inflationary. Furniture, I mentioned, yada, yada. And this is the specific items I've listed here, I believe are going to increase in price because of tariffs on, again, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand. All of these places produce lots of sort of light manufacturing, low-tier appliances of one kind or another of the variety listed. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand, you might not think of those as places that produce appliances, but keep in mind, lots of Chinese manufacturers have invested in these countries to relocate their factories to get around American tariffs. That's a process that started way back in 2018 in Trump's first term when the trade war first started, and it's an ongoing process. Also, Chinese wages have been going up since like 2010 anyway, which was making their low-cost manufacturing less competitive. And so there was actually already in process in play, however you want to phrase that, a shift away from China in terms of light manufacturing. Manufacturers were increasingly relocating to take advantage of cheaper labor elsewhere. So to a degree, this is accelerating a process that already started, although the fact that they're also going after the beneficiaries of that transition, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand, calls into question whether or not that continue and whether there might be some other parties that benefit going forward. We'll see. So that's light manufacturing. Heavy manufacturing, cars, car parts, those are all going up in price. Again, that has to do with tariffs on Mexico, Canada, the EU, and Japan. Buses. I was not aware of this, but apparently the United States imports a lot of buses from Spain. Apparently about 30-some% of imported bodies and chassis for trucks and buses come from Spain. Who knew? So I guess buses then, I presume, will become more expensive, corresponding with the 10% tariff on the EU in place right now, potentially 20% in future. Machinery, this is an important one. So machinery includes things like machine tools, things like stamps, dies, what do you call them, molds, and CNC machinery. If you don't know what CNC machinery is, those are basically like the robot arms that carve chunks of metal into specific shapes according to a program that you input into them. So that type of machinery, machine tools especially, that's mostly produced in Europe and in Japan. And the tariffs, obviously, on those places are at least 10%, potentially higher in future. And that's going to be a big tax on all manufacturers in the United States, because all manufacturers in the United States use machine tools. And again, they almost universally import them from abroad. So not only will everything manufactured in the United States in turn suffer some inflationary effect from this, this also undermines the argument that, let me rephrase. This also undermines the alleged plan by the administration to reshore manufacturing into the United States, because that's going to require a lot of investing in new manufacturing. And by tariffing machine tools, you're actually making reshoring more expensive. In general, you're making setting up new factories at all more expensive because, again, machine tools are a major input. So this is an example of the administration working at cross purposes with itself. Again, that just assumes that reshoring is an actual objective, and we don't know that. Again, very debatable. Advanced manufacturing. So electronics will go up in price. This is one I was particularly dreading up until the exemption was announced a few days ago. Although it was announced today that the exemption announced a few days ago for electronics will actually be temporary. Welcome to the fucking roller coaster. So electronics will go up in price invariably because of tariffs on Taiwan, China, and the European Union. Computers. This is computers, appliances, smartphones, stereo equipment, etc. Given that China is already subject to 149% tariffs, if the exemption that they currently enjoy does end, we're looking at a significant increase in price for example, GPUs, your graphics cards for your computers, memory sticks for your computers, computers in general that are already assembled. Anybody who enjoys computers, which I assume is like 99% of people listening to me right now, you're going to get fucked pretty hard by that. So here's hoping the exemption sticks around and that the administration is just bullshitting everybody. We shall see. We're all going to lose quite a bit of money on this electronics thing in particular, if that does go through. Electronics maker, this is just other stuff that electronics makers in the US have stopped ordering parts because they want to wait and see what happens with tariffs. So this is already having some impact, even with just the 10% baseline tariffs. Solar panels also affected, but they were also exempted recently, so may or may not increase in price depending. Okay, so that's the secondary sector. And again, already went through the exemptions. Let's see. I guess I had a list here of which countries benefit from which exemptions. So I'll just get through this quickly. Pharmaceuticals exemption, that benefits China, a major producer of pharmaceuticals, and more specifically, a major producer of what are called API, which are the main chemical ingredients used to make drugs, to make pharmaceutical goods of one kind or another. India also benefits greatly from the exemption. That's another major producer of drugs. Interestingly, a lot of the inputs for Indian pharmaceuticals manufactured in India are imported from China. So China makes the API, exports them to India. India uses them to make drugs and then exports them to the United States. That's how the supply chain works. So both China and India greatly benefit then from an exemption for pharmaceuticals. The European Union and Switzerland also benefit because they also make a good deal of pharmaceuticals of one kind or another and export them to the United States. The gold exemption. This is the Boolean exemption I mentioned before. So Chad and Mali benefit, although it's kind of limited because they're relatively minor exporters, but of the countries that got tariffed, those were the ones that had gold as one of their top exports to the United States. They benefit disproportionately. There are definitely other countries that export more gold in raw quantity to the United States, but generally those exports are not as large a proportion of exports to the United States as they are with Chad and Mali. So Chad and Mali are the particular winners there. Energy exemption, obvious answer, the GCC greatly benefits from that. Those are the Gulf countries, the Gulf oil producers like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. Even with a 10% tariff, like it wouldn't have hit all that hard. Like I mentioned earlier, oil has a pretty inelastic price elasticity of demand, but even so, it's a win for them not to basically have their main export to the US be taxed. Copper, that's a big win for Chile. I don't know how many Chileans are listening, but props to you. Your main export to the United States got exempted. Chile produces a lot of different stuff, but easily the largest item is copper. They're investing more in lithium mining, but that's still pretty nascent. So copper is like the main thing. And again, to reiterate, copper is one of the main ingredients for semiconductors, chips, what have you. And so having a ready access to copper is pretty important for that industry. And so correspondingly, anybody who exports copper makes a lot of money just because of the massive amount of electronics that are produced every year. So Chile definitely dodged a bullet here. Semiconductors. Taiwan and South Korea benefit greatly from this exemption. Taiwan and South Korea in particular had tariffs in the reciprocal tariff chart anyway in excess of 20%. Taiwan's, I think, was in excess of 30%. So if the reciprocal tariffs do end up getting implemented as they were initially announced, they would be hit particularly hard, but the semiconductor exemption helps a lot. Taiwan's main export to the United States, I believe, is semiconductors. So while the higher tariffs would definitely hurt various parts of its economy, having its main export be exempt will probably preserve them from the worst of the damage if the higher tariffs do end up getting implemented. That is to say, those beyond 10%. Basically the same story with South Korea, but on a smaller scale. Semiconductors are a major export for Korea to the US, but they export a lot of stuff to the US, cars, electronics, etc. So the exemption to semiconductors doesn't mean as much for them, but it is helpful. That is big money for for certain companies in South Korea that export them anyway. Lumber exemption. Making sense of the lumber exemption is a little difficult. I'm not really sure why it made the list. It could be that the government, that is to say the Trump administration, wants to try to intimidate Canada. They may be signaling here that this is something that they're going to negotiate in future. That's the best I can do. Otherwise, no idea. Regardless, lumber got an exemption, and obviously that's going to benefit Canada mostly, because I believe Canada is the largest exporter of lumber into the United States. I also thought it was weird because I would have thought CUSMA would cover lumber. That again, is the NAFTA agreement that Trump renegotiated. The Trump admin already announced that pretty much all goods except for cars and car parts, for whatever reason, will still be subject to lower tariffs so long as they are in compliance with rules of origin rules in CUSMA. Presumably that would encompass lumber, because that is obviously 100% made in Canada. But for some reason, the administration decided to give them an exemption. So make of that what you will. If anybody has more clarity on that, please let me know. I'm curious. Rare earths exemption, that's obviously going to be China. Rare earths are not like a large value exporter for China. Like the total value of exports to the United States is not huge, but it's immensely strategic. as already discussed, China pretty much cornered that market, and a number of industries in the United States need it, including industries that are receiving priority for the US government, like the semiconductor industry in the United States. So China kind of dodging a bullet there. I guess not dodging a bullet. That is basically just a point of leverage for them that the United States is tiptoeing around. If China ever really wants to drop the hammer, cutting off rare earth exports would be the way to do it. Okay, so that's exemptions and which countries benefit from them, and those are more, I guess, well, no, that's basically just it. I don't know why I put it here. I made these notes relatively quickly, and I've been having to add to them constantly over the past 2 weeks. So I haven't had a lot of time to really organize them coherently.
Thank you for your notes.
Okay, so that's the secondary sector. Tertiary sector is next. So these are primary effects, but they kind of straddle the line between primary and secondary because honestly, and maybe some people aren't aware of this, but tariffs only applied to goods imported into the United States, not services. So they're pretty much irrelevant to services in a direct way. Their direct influence is zero. But obviously, the services sector in the United States is intrinsically tied to the trade in goods, to trade in various kinds of goods. And so invariably, the tertiary sector is going to be affected and has been affected. So stock market is the main example. Lots of drama. I think the value varies, but in the immediate aftermath of the announcement of the new tariffs on April 2nd, the stock market in subsequent days lost over $6 trillion. And that's big money even for the US stock market, which trades in lots of trillions of dollars every day. Now, I think it's gone up a little bit since then. I think I saw a number like 10, 11 trillion recently, but I don't know if that's true. I haven't seen that verified yet. But at the very least, 6 trillion was lost at one point. And that's because a lot of the companies on the New York Stock Exchange, among other stock exchanges in the United States, are themselves producers of goods that are either imported from abroad or have inputs that are imported from abroad. And also that export a lot abroad to markets that may be closed to them in the near future as a result of retaliatory tariffs. So because of those reasons, traders sold off. Their impression was that the tariffs would have an immensely negative effect on the balance sheets of many, many firms, including some of the largest. And that was why the stock markets just tanked and have been in the red pretty consistently since then. So obviously that's bad news for investment banks and other market traders of various kinds, but it's also bad news for anybody who's trying to save money for retirement, because this basically means unless the market corrects in fairly short order, that your plans have probably been delayed for a while. To give you a quick anecdote, I had a professor when I was in grad school who was like months away from retirement. And you could tell. He was one of those guys where you could tell he was kind of phoning it in so he could just get the fuck out. I'm ready to be done. I want to go and be retired and not have to deal with shit anymore. He was one of those guys. And the first class I had with him, it just happened to coincide with the 2008 financial crisis. And he lost so much money, and he was bitter about it because it meant that he couldn't retire the way that he wanted to. Specifically, he couldn't retire when he wanted to because he was so close, but because of all the money that was lost, he had to delay it. He had to try to make some of that money back by waiting for the market to recover. So it ended up fucking with him. And he let us know. He wasn't mean about it, but he was just like, yeah, that fucked me over pretty good. Thanks.
Damn. Unfortunate.
So if you're a long-term investor, the stock market declining or even tanking isn't necessarily a big deal because it is going to go back up eventually, presumably. However, if you're an older guy, that's not necessarily a comfort because you've been saving up over time and waiting out all of the dips and rises in the stock market for a particular reason. That reason is generally retirement. And big shifts like this, specifically big declines like this in the stock market, they have a disproportionate effect on you in so much as they affect your plans in the short term. So those are the people, specifically retirees or older people who are about to be retired, that are going to bear most of the burden from the dramatics in the stock market that stem from this. Those are the people you should feel the most sorry for. You can feel a little sorry for, JP Morgan if you want. They've lost money too, but I think they'll be okay. Let's see, the bond markets. Holy shit. This is wild. I've never seen this. And this is the thing that has everybody talking. This is the thing that may well have scared the Trump administration into announcing the 90-day pause on tariffs. Because it kind of seemed like they were pretty content just to scare the shit out of everybody. And that maybe the higher tariffs would go into place for a while until everybody ran to Trump to kiss his ass. His words, everybody's running to me, kissing my ass. He actually posted that online. He might have actually implemented the higher tariffs in a very short time frame to try to speed those negotiations. But one theory is that the bond market's performance on April the 9th, when the tariffs were actually implemented, scared the admin into announcing the delay. Is that true? No idea. Nobody knows for sure. Like with the Trump admin, it's anybody's guess. But it's entirely possible. Because one of the implicit assumptions that a lot of the advisors in the Trump administration have been making is that the US economy is so important to the global economy that the US could make a lot of waves, make some trade barriers, be unpredictable, such that even with those waves, it would not affect the US dollar or US Treasury bonds, because those are too important to the global economy. US dollar is basically the medium of exchange for global commerce, and US Treasury bonds are the default safest asset for the global financial sector. So even if the US is fucking around in its trading relationships, the assumption was the US is so strong economically that those cornerstone assets would remain untouched. That basically we're so strong that we could just do this without consequence. And then bonds started tanking. And suddenly that logic looks very wrong, or at the very least brittle. And like I said, we've never really seen this. I saw a chart the other day showing that the US dollar and US Treasury bonds almost always move in correlation. It's a very tight correlation regardless. And you can see over time, even through all of the, the Great Recession, COVID, like all of the big dramatic events, they almost always move very strongly in unison until April the 9th. And then you can see them split, like dramatically, like notably, unmistakably, moving in very clearly opposite directions. Like even if they didn't move with 100% correlation in the past, it was always in the same direction at least. But now the relationship is negative. Like the US dollar is declining at the same time that the value of treasury bonds are declining. That's not happened in a very long time. I don't even know when the last time, probably the Great Depression would be my guess. So the reason that's significant for those of you who maybe don't know is that it suggests what's called capital flight. And if you don't know what that means, good for you, you probably don't live in a developing country. Because if you live in a developing country, you definitely know what capital flight is. It's the bane of your existence, especially if you live in a place like, say, Argentina. I don't know if Dagnip is listening, but I'm sure he can extol on the virtues of capital flight and all of the wonderful things it does to your economy. So capital flight is just when money leaves your economy. It's when investors who have invested money either in stocks, bonds, or other assets, buildings, companies, whatever, it's when they start selling off and pulling their money out of your economy. It's strongly associated with developing markets because developing markets implies developing country, and institutions in developing countries tend to be weak, such that there could be dramatic changes in policy that affect the economy in unpredictable ways. Basically, they're more risky bets. And like with any risky bet, risky bettors tend to get flitted, tend to get skittish when things kind of get going badly. So if something bad happens in a developing market, or if even the hint of something bad happening in a developing market hits the news, investors will start pulling out money, and the value of that country's currency will decline, People will stop buying their debt. And the result of those two things happening at the same time is that imports get very expensive and the government can't borrow money to cover its expenditures, which generally causes a debt crisis because they very frequently depend on borrowing money to cover outstanding debt obligations. And the resulting debt crisis frequently makes things even worse, which ultimately leads to hyperinflation and a crashed economy. Capital flight is muy bad. You don't want that. It's not supposed to happen in developed countries because they're seen as so safe that even when bad things happen, you kind of assume that they'll get back on their feet. Capital flight is something associated with developing markets also because it's a kind of a vote of no confidence. Like in the same way that they stay in developed markets because they're so safe and secure and strong, you pull out of the developing markets because you don't really trust them not to fuck things up. Unless things are going pretty well, you're probably not going to trust them with your money. So for a developed economy to experience capital flight is wild. That's not supposed to happen. And that is most likely what we are experiencing. I've seen other people try to rationalize it in different corners of the internet and also from the administration saying, oh, it's just a technical thing. You know, it's just companies trying to sell off so that they can cover bets that they made that didn't pan out because of tariffs. There's different excuses, but it was too big to be just that, and it's been ongoing since then too. It hasn't really fully stopped, and that suggests that this is a structural thing. This is a structural readjustment of global financial portfolios away from the United States. And I remind you, as we've discussed many times on this segment over the years since we've been doing it, the United States is the strongest country in the world and has the strongest economy in the world because it has rule of law. That's where it comes from. Confidence in that is why people put their money here. The US dollar is the strongest currency because people have confidence that when they invest money here, when they put their money here, it's going to be safe. The government's not going to do some banana republic bullshit and destroy its value or just outright steal it. But if rule of law is brought into question, that underlying calculus changes. And to account for that new risk, you need to pull money out to reflect that. Again, not supposed to happen with developed economies. So if this continues, this has the potential to be a very big deal. And it's not even just a sign of the times. It's not even just a sign that markets are losing confidence in the US as an investment vehicle, as a growth market, et cetera. It's also a problem because it pushes up the rates that the US government borrows at. There's been a notable increase. Like the Federal Reserve is technically responsible for setting interest rates, but it doesn't have full control over them. It has control over the prime rate. That's the rate that is used to calculate all of the other rates in the economy. But they can't stop all of those other rates from fluctuating. And if they spike, and including for treasury bonds, the Federal Reserve has limited tools to deal with that. They can try using foreign reserve currencies to buy US dollars to float the value and decrease rates on bonds. But at that point, you're in a battle with markets. And so what's going to happen then is that markets are going to look at the math and they're going to say, okay, the Federal Reserve has X amount of foreign currency. They can afford to keep buying dollars for this long. If we keep the speculative pressure on the dollar, eventually they'll run out of money, and then we can bet on the US dollar devaluating and make a bunch of money on shorts. So again, this is a very familiar mechanic for people living in developing countries, because what will happen is periodically there will be a speculative run on their currency, and their central bank will try to prop up the value of that currency by spending foreign currency on their own currency to reflate the value. I know it's a little complicated, but bear with me. Generally what happens is that either the speculative run ends because it was based off of bullshit, or the central bank runs out of foreign currency entirely and is left with nothing, and there's a crash. Now, the Federal Reserve, as you might imagine, as a major bank, central bank, de facto central bank, for a major developed economy, has lots of foreign reserves it could use. But markets are bigger than the Federal Reserve. Markets are bigger than fucking everybody. When you fight a battle with markets, you are going to lose most of the time. And the example I'll bring up is the Bank of England. Some of you British people who might be listening know immediately what I'm talking about. This happened in the early 90s. And this was at a time when the UK was planning to join the Eurozone, right? Not the European Union, but the Eurozone. They were planning to adopt the euro as their currency, which would involve replacing the pound. And in order to do that, one of the preconditions for participating countries is that they had to fix the value of their currency relative to a certain value. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. They had like this sort of fake euro currency that they were trying to float in markets. It was a whole thing. But basically, they had to fix the value of the pound to a certain value. And whenever it deviated, the central bank of the UK, the Bank of England, had to intervene in markets to try to keep it within a certain band. That is to say, within a certain set of values. And what happened is that there was a period in the early 90s when the currency was under a lot of pressure because Britain's foreign trade was out of balance. You know, they were importing more than they were exporting. Britain's finances, like always, were not that great. And so speculators in financial markets noticed that, and they said, you know what? I bet if we started betting that the pound will devalue, that the Bank of England will spend a bunch of money trying to reflate the value, and eventually we'll just run out, and then the currency will crash, and we'll make a bunch of money. And so it turned into a kind of a fight, basically. Markets bet more and more money that the pound would devalue and that the Bank of England would get up. The Bank of England spent more and more of its money buying the pound, trying to reflate the value. And there was a standoff. And ultimately, markets won that battle. And the reason they won that battle is that as big and powerful as the Bank of England is, markets are bigger. Trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars are traded on markets every day. And the amount of money that individual central banks have is maybe $1 trillion, probably more like a couple $100 billion. The fact that they move markets at all is more testament to the market's confidence that when central banks say that they're going to intervene to support a currency or a stock market or what have you, that they're willing to go the distance. But markets rarely make them do that because it's not really worth their time. But when it is worth their time to challenge a central bank policy, they win most of the time. If you want another example, look at Russia after 2022. When the war started, a bunch of sanctions were heaped on Russia's financial sector. The Russian central bank spent a bunch of foreign currency trying to prop up the ruble. They had $1 trillion or so, maybe even more, that had been saved up over time, specifically to act as an emergency reserve in a specific example like that, where the currency was under attack. And they ran out of money in 2 weeks. Like hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of foreign currency spent, and in the end, markets just ignored it. They just ran out of money before markets did, and that's almost always going to happen. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, yes, the United States is uniquely positioned as a major economy, with the Federal Reserve being as large and wealthy as it is, to try to withstand that kind of speculative attack if the Federal Reserve does try to lower rates to try to undo the impact of this loss of confidence in the US economy. But if markets are convinced that this lack of confidence is well-deserved and long-term, and if they want to put serious money behind betting on that, the Federal Reserve will lose. Guaranteed. They will run the fuck right out of money. Now, I'm really hoping we don't get to that point, because that really would be some Banana Republic bullshit. Even more so than all of the other Banana Republic bullshit we've already seen. And that will crash the value of the dollar and anybody who has their savings in dollars, which I remind you is most of us. I'm assuming most people listening are American. This does put your savings in danger, because inflation will spike, your purchasing power will decline, and you will be fucked in a multitude of exotic and fascinating ways.
Oh, no.
So, that's the bond market. Put a pin in that. If you pay attention to nothing else that I've talked about here, pay attention to the bond market, because that especially is interesting right now. But beyond that, we're still talking about primary effects of tariffs, and we're talking about the tertiary sector. So another impact here has to do with artificial intelligence. A big part of the artificial intelligence boom in the United States involves investment into the development of artificial intelligence chips. And in so much as chips are going to get more expensive because their inputs are more expensive on account of tariffs, and also some of the tariffs are imported from abroad and will be more expensive for that reason, that's going to have an impact on the overall AI industry in the United States. Okay. I had a special note here. This is the end of the impact section, the primary impact section anyway. Some of these impacts will also be mitigated because of tariff evasion. These are basically efforts by companies to find ways to get around tariffs. And they always find ways. It could be directly appealing to the government in question to try to get exemptions. It could be reclassifying their goods so that they're subject to a lower tariff than they would be otherwise. It could be redirecting a good through a third-party country because that country is subject to a lower tariff than the one you're from. There's a lot of different ways to do this, and you better believe that if these tariffs get hiked, that there's going to be a whole shit ton of that. There's probably already going to be a whole shit ton of that because the tariffs on China actually did get hiked, again, to 149%. So I'm sure Chinese producers are trying to find any and every way they can find to circumnavigate these tariffs. So re-export, shell companies, tariff evasion, just broadly speaking, that's going to happen a lot. Oh, I also had here, the higher the tariffs, the more elaborate the evasion. So because the tariffs are so high and because there's just so much stuff produced in China, there's very, very strong incentive to engage in tariff evasion. And so you can bet that there's going to be good money invested in finding ever more elaborate ways of doing it. Okay.
You're at 2 hours 55.
Fuck. I have much more, but I don't know how far you want to go, and we could just save this for a part 2 episode next week.
I think we can do a part 2. Let me process stuff just based on the big picture of what we've received so far. And I know we haven't gone through everything that you've given us, but this is an overall aggressive move for the United States, and it's going to make things more expensive for most average consumers in the U.S. And it also isn't really great for our reputation, but there is an argument going around that it will be deflationary in the long term if it destroys certain markets, which that sounds sad to me, but you never know. We'll see what happens. But like you said, everything could be switched off pretty much right away, so people don't really know what to expect.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So it could just be kayfabe.
Easily.
Elaborate, very elaborate kayfabe.
It could be that's why they told countries not to retaliate. It could just be theater, and they don't want people to actually disrupt trade because they want a grandstand for their domestic political audience. Well, next time on Reciprocal Tariffs, we'll be talking about winners and losers by industry, winners and losers by country, and then I'll finally get to secondary effects of tariffs, which goes well beyond just the direct effects already discussed. And we will also do a case study on car parts, which seem to be a particular fixation for the Trump administration. And I'll go through some takeaways as far as to how reciprocal tariffs were designed and maybe what they're intended to do. And finally, a long section critiquing reciprocal tariffs and their underlying logic, as well as some adjacent logic that is relevant.
Well, thank you for going through this and collecting all of your notes and giving your expertise. I know we had questions. Sorry, chat. There was a lot to go over, and time flies when you're talking about tariffs in the current climate. But thank you for hanging out. He reads the chat after, so if you have any hot takes or corrections, we can add those in for the next time. We will see you all in the next episode of Woe Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.